A broke young noble crossed a deadly frontier to claim worthless swamp land, only to become the ruler every monster tribe would fear. The strangest part was that Wright Lewis never planned to look powerful. Half his victories began with desperation, bad luck, and one hidden advantage. His new life opened with a horse, a muddy swamp, and 3 bodyguards who suddenly decided that murder sounded more profitable than escort work. The men drew steel and demanded his royal land deed, certain the elegant purple-haired teenager would surrender before anyone had to spill blood. Wright tried the respectable noble approach first, reminding them that robbery and murder could end with ropes around their necks. The warning only made them laugh, because 3 armed mercenaries saw nothing dangerous in one thin young aristocrat stranded beyond civilization. So Wright changed tactics and offered to forget the betrayal if they simply walked away, but that only convinced them he was terrified. One scarred attacker gathered fighting spirit around his body and mocked the territory Wright had spent nearly everything to obtain. According to the mercenary, the land was so miserable that even birds would refuse to leave droppings there. Wright let him finish, slipped a steam pistol from inside his robe, and fired before the man understood what he was seeing. The shot shattered the smug confidence on every face, because nobles were not supposed to carry hidden weapons like that. Before the bald mercenary could recover, Wright drew a second pistol and turned the ambush into a massacre lasting only moments. 3 men who had expected easy money lay dead beside the road, while Wright stood between them with 2 smoking guns. His satisfaction lasted until every horse panicked and fled, taking away transportation worth more than almost everything he still owned. Wright searched the corpses, recovered whatever money they carried, and accepted that his grand entrance had somehow become even less dignified. That absurd beginning made more sense once one understood that Wright Lewis had already lived and died in another world. In his first life, a failing heart had turned childhood into a countdown, with doctors warning that he probably would not reach 20. He spent most of those years trapped indoors, unable to travel freely, unable to risk excitement, and unable to imagine a normal future. What he did have was a strategy game called Shadow of the Golden Tree, and he poured nearly every waking hour into mastering it. The game centered on building territories, surviving wars, managing races, and navigating dozens of branching storylines across a brutal fantasy world. Wright cleared every route he could find, learned the systems obsessively, and eventually earned the game's ultimate reward, the legendary Golden Tree. Then his weak heart finally stopped while he slept, ending the life he had spent mostly watching adventures through a screen. Instead of disappearing, his consciousness awakened inside the body of another Wright Lewis, a young noble who had just died in that game world. The first miracle was simple but overwhelming. This body breathed easily, moved freely, and carried no fatal heart disease. For someone who had spent a lifetime measuring every heartbeat, merely standing without fear felt like receiving an entire world. The second miracle was far more complicated, because the world around him really was connected to Shadow of the Golden Tree. Yet the timeline was wrong, placing him in an ancient prequel era barely described in the game he knew so well. An immortal emperor still ruled a vast holy empire, new kingdoms were expanding, and dark supernatural fog had begun swallowing parts of the continent. Wright knew enough lore to understand that history was moving toward catastrophe, even if he did not know every event in this forgotten age. His new family, the Lewis house, possessed noble status but little influence, and several older siblings stood ahead of him in succession. Remaining at the estate would have meant a comfortable life with no real authority, no adventure, and no chance to build anything of his own. After losing one life inside a room, Wright refused to spend the second one politely waiting for someone else to decide his future. He sold nearly everything personally belonging to him and searched for the cheapest land deed a minor noble could legally purchase. Affordable territory inside the kingdom was impossible, so he looked beyond the border where monsters, war, and bad roads destroyed normal property values. What he finally bought was called a flying territory, a flattering name for land so isolated that the kingdom barely considered it connected. The deed covered roughly 30 kilometers of unwanted frontier packed with swamp, forest, hills, and creatures strong enough to kill ordinary settlers. Wright knew it was reckless, but recklessness looked different to a young man who had already died without ever truly living. He wanted roads under his feet, danger in front of him, and a home that existed because he had created it himself. That dream explained why 3 corpses and a missing horse did not make him turn back toward the safety of his family. He dragged the bodies around the swamp, reached the edge of his legal territory, and immediately used knowledge the original owner had hidden. The former Wright had feared death so intensely that he secretly collected forbidden necromancy, despite the churches treating it as an unforgivable crime. Wright cut himself for the ritual, used blood as the catalyst, and ordered the 3 dead mercenaries to rise again. Their flesh dissolved into dark sludge while clean bones pulled themselves upright, leaving 3 glowing-eyed skeleton soldiers waiting for commands. To the churches, that sight would have justified execution by fire, but Wright understood death very differently because of his game knowledge. He believed souls simply dispersed after death instead of traveling to divine kingdoms, which made necromancy feel more practical than sacrilegious to him. Practical or not, he knew discovery would ruin him, so his new skeletal guards became a secret weapon rather than a public army. Once the perimeter felt secure, Wright opened the leather case containing the object that had consumed almost his entire fortune. The royal land deed shimmered with divine golden light, created by the world's supreme creator and recognized by nations, dragons, and powerful beings alike. Signing such a deed did more than record ownership. It spiritually connected a lord to the soil and enhanced the territory itself. Resources could recover, farmland could remain fertile, and the owner gained supernatural authority inside the claimed borders. Wright sliced a finger with a silver dagger, wrote his name in blood, and gave the wilderness a name of its own. He called it Golden Domain, and the deed dissolved into countless sparks that sank deep beneath the earth. For the first time across 2 lives, Wright felt that one place in the world truly belonged to him. The emotional moment ended when something smashed one skeleton apart and 7 gray-scaled lizard men stormed from the swamp. They carried stone axes, spoke broken common language, and viewed the new human lord less as a neighbor than as available meat. Wright barely dodged a thrown axe, sent his remaining skeletons forward, and discovered how badly basic undead matched up against experienced swamp hunters. His pistol wounded one attacker but failed to penetrate deeply enough, turning an angry lizard man into an even angrier one. With his weak physical stats and almost no useful combat magic, Wright reached for the reward no one else in this era could possibly expect. He called upon the golden tree he had earned before dying, and a tiny luminous branch appeared directly from his soul. Roots pierced the frontier soil, the sapling shot upward, and golden leaves unfolded beneath the dirty gray sky. One brilliant fruit appeared on a branch, exactly matching the starter reward Wright remembered from the game. The fruit carried a contract ability linked to a green frog creature with a huge seed growing across its back. Wright activated the fruit without eating it, a privilege belonging only to the master of the golden tree. A squat green summon appeared beside him, looking suspiciously familiar to something from the entertainment of his previous world. He ordered the creature to attack, and its back split open before releasing a storm of leaves sharp enough to cut armor. The first wave ripped through 3 lizard men so quickly that blood and shredded scales struck the mud before the others could react. Suddenly the invaders understood that the apparently helpless human had produced something far deadlier than his firearms. Wright had another problem, because maintaining the summoned frog drained stamina every second and his body was already close to collapse. He could not allow the survivors to escape and return with reinforcements while he lay unconscious beside a newly planted tree. So he attacked the one weakness his game knowledge suggested would override their survival instincts: fierce devotion to their mates. Wright insulted the lizard men's wives badly enough that every remaining warrior abandoned caution and charged him in pure rage. His skeletons delayed one attacker, his pistol disrupted another, and the green frog carved through the rest with repeated blade-like leaves. When the last lizard man fell, Wright collapsed to the ground as his summon vanished with the final scraps of his stamina. He had survived his first territorial battle, but celebration died when he noticed that his final horse had also fled during the chaos. Golden Domain now contained 1 living human, a few usable skeletons, 7 lizard corpses, and absolutely no conventional workforce. Hiring nearby settlers was not realistic either, because no sensible laborer wanted to cross the kingdom border for a broke lord offering danger instead of wages. Wright therefore raised more skeletons from the fallen, and put the undead to work cutting timber without food, rest, complaints, or salaries. By the first evening, 9 skeletons were swinging tools while their teenage lord inspected the statistics only he could see. His attributes were humiliatingly modest, and his supernatural rank sat near the top of Black Iron, the lowest meaningful tier. Above Black Iron waited Bronze, Silver, Gold, Platinum Legend, and powers approaching true divinity, which made his current position painfully clear. The golden tree could strengthen him, but its growth required magic crystals formed in the hearts of supernatural beings. Ordinary Black Iron creatures produced nothing useful, meaning the lizard men he had just killed supplied corpses but no precious crystals. Wright spent the next hours surveying his purchase and discovered that the merchant's description had been optimistic to the point of criminal comedy. Roughly a third of the land was swamp occupied by hostile lizard men, another third was forest marked by enormous ogre footprints. The remaining hills held grass and normal wildlife but no farms, no roads, and most importantly, no human refugees the seller had promised. Wright searched until denial became impossible. The supposed settlers did not exist, and he had paid for empty, dangerous wilderness. At least the land deed itself remained genuine, giving him abilities that ordinary travelers could never reproduce. Inside Golden Domain, Wright could teleport between locations, making him extremely difficult to trap on his own soil. He could also banish a limited number of intelligent intruders, and curse their luck while they remained within his territory. The deed replenished natural resources over time as well, which meant even this miserable frontier could become valuable if he survived long enough. Survival was already becoming complicated, because the lizard tribe learned that 7 warriors had disappeared after confronting the human newcomer. Their chief was a scarred bronze-ranked reptilian fighter who carried an old hatred of humans after nearly dying in an earlier clash. Rather than reconsidering the behavior that caused that old conflict, he had decided humans themselves were the problem. His one-eyed lieutenant confirmed that Wright had activated a royal land deed, and the news transformed hostility into ambition. The tribe's swamp was starving, winters were brutal, and food sources had been shrinking for years under constant pressure. The chief convinced himself that stealing the deed could make him the first true lizard man king, and magically solve his people's suffering. Pride, hunger, and desperation turned his speech into a war cry, and dozens of warriors armed themselves for a night attack. Around 50 lizard men surrounded Wright's crude wooden shelter, including several supernatural fighters, and a chief strong enough to crush him easily. At the signal they exploded through the walls, expecting blood panic, and an easy human corpse waiting inside. They found nothing except an empty room and the sudden realization that their target had somehow vanished. The chief rejected the obvious possibility that Wright had simply left, because he believed a deed holder could never abandon his land. He ordered the tribe to search every corner, convinced the human was hiding somewhere and preparing another trick. In reality, Wright had examined his odds, reached the extremely sensible conclusion that he would die, and evacuated before the raid began. He built a crude platform from wood and vines, placed 4 skeletons beneath it, and turned the undead into walking wheels. Riding that ridiculous bone-powered cart, the Lord of Golden Domain retreated towards civilization with every intention of returning stronger. He buried the remaining skeletons across his territory for later use, preserving a hidden force, while the lizard tribe searched for an enemy already gone. 9 exhausting days later, black walls finally appeared on the horizon, and Wright reached Blackstone Fortress near the kingdom's dangerous border. The heavily militarized city existed under constant threat from the neighboring Beast Alliance, so security was strict and commerce moved behind guarded gates. Wright did not come for sightseeing. He came because one object in his inventory could convert desperation into enough money to build a settlement. The golden tree had already granted him the green frog's summoning ability, but the physical fruit remained valuable to anyone else who ate it. Better still, the tree's master could revoke a granted fruit power later, giving Wright hidden control over anyone who benefited from his treasures. He washed away road grime, dressed in his finest noble clothing, and entered the Iris Flower Trading Company looking wealthier than he actually was. After days of swamp water and skeleton transportation, even the coffee in the reception room felt like a luxury from another life. Wright maintained a calm aristocratic expression, while an elderly appraiser examined the golden fruit through a magical identification lens. The man's composure disappeared as he realized the fruit could permanently grant a summoning ability to its user. When asked where such a treasure came from, Wright casually invented a story about family elders discovering it inside a terrifying forbidden forest. The lie worked because no rational merchant intended to march into a monster-filled death zone just to verify one nobleman's claim. Wright's appearance helped enormously. Vivid purple hair, red eyes, an unusually refined face suggested an ancient bloodline far more prestigious than reality. His actual family looked ordinary by noble standards, but genetics had accidentally given him the perfect face for intimidating negotiations. The appraiser recommended auctioning the fruit for an extraordinary sum, then explained that the next major auction remained months away. Wright could not comfortably afford a hotel for that long, so he listened very carefully when the company offered an immediate private purchase. The figure reached 3.5 million nars, more money than Wright had ever possessed and more than his frontier territory had cost. Internally he nearly lost control, but externally he treated the fortune like an amount hardly worth discussing. He accepted on one condition: the trading house would keep his identity secret whenever the fruit was resold later. Wright disguised the request as family privacy, hiding the embarrassing truth that a powerful buyer could otherwise trace everything back to a nearly penniless minor noble. They signed a magically enforced contract under the Church of Fairness and Law, making false identities or broken terms much harder to hide. The sale succeeded, money entered his hands, and Wright immediately withdrew enough cash to begin solving Golden Domain's most obvious weakness. He needed workers, craftsmen, guards, food, tools, seeds, horses, and practically every object a functioning settlement normally took for granted. His first stop was the office of the merchant who had sold him the territory and promised imaginary farmers. The office had been stripped clean, because the merchant realized his hired killers never returned and wisely vanished before Wright could confront him. Hiring ordinary workers proved almost as frustrating, since skilled people refused to enter monster territory beyond the kingdom's protection. Unskilled applicants demanded absurd advance payments, clearly hoping to take his money and disappear long before reaching the frontier. Autumn was approaching, Beast Alliance attacks were increasing, and border lords were dying often enough to make Wright's offer sound suicidal. After days of failure, he remembered a legal distinction that changed his entire recruitment problem. The king had abolished human slavery, but the law still permitted ownership of captured non-human races sold through regulated markets. Wright walked into the fortress slave market, an institution protected by soldiers and controlled by the powerful Count Chapman Cook. Cages held beast folk of many kinds, and the monopoly ensured that every skilled captive carried an outrageous price. A manager enthusiastically recommended great goblins as heavy laborers because they ate little, worked hard, and possessed excellent physical strength. He also offered rabbit folk, whose smaller bodies and precise hands made them useful for carpentry, sewing, and detailed construction. Wright compared the one-time purchase costs with the monthly wages ordinary frontier laborers demanded and made a cold economic decision. He bought 10 great goblins and 20 rabbit folk, enough people to transform Golden Domain from a graveyard into a work camp. He also asked for someone capable of managing a noble household, supplies, accounts, schedules, and the 1,000 details he personally kept forgetting. The manager could not promise a butler immediately, so Wright spent the rest of the day purchasing axes, saws, farming tools, food, and construction supplies. The following morning, the slave market presented a far more valuable candidate than another cage of workers. Her name was Holly, a golden-haired woman wearing a perfectly maintained butler uniform despite having almost nothing left in her life. She had been born noble, lost her family's fortune, served another household, and eventually married the youngest son of that family. Then worshippers of an evil god caused a disaster that destroyed the household while Holly and her young daughter Ellie happened to be away. Debts consumed the surviving assets, rumors branded Holly cursed, and respectable families stopped offering her work. Wright recognized the danger of evil god corruption from the game, so he secretly appraised her before allowing sympathy to overrule caution. Her statistics were ordinary, her profession showed no hidden cult allegiance, and nothing suggested supernatural contamination. Holly asked for a monthly wage, room, food, and one promise above everything else. If danger came, Wright would protect Ellie. He agreed immediately, then tested Holly by handing her responsibility for the entire return expedition to Golden Domain. She organized horses, mercenary escorts, food for months, clothing, bedding, tools, crop seeds, and details Wright had repeatedly forgotten. Her efficiency convinced him before the journey even began, and Holly finally gained a stable position for herself and her daughter. Meanwhile, Wright inspected the 30 slaves and discovered that one great goblin possessed genuine black iron supernatural power. The manager claimed that goblin had served as a squad leader in the Beast Alliance army, making him seem especially valuable. Wright knew awakening power normally required rare materials or potions, because natural advancement among ordinary races was difficult and expensive. His own magical training was equally embarrassing, with no real attack spell despite access to a legendary divine tree. He knew skeleton summoning, illumination, cleaning magic, and plant growth acceleration, leaving his pistols to handle most immediate violence. The slaves wore collars and emergency binding runes designed to suppress escape, though religious safeguards limited certain forms of abuse. Wright signed the purchase contract but delayed departure long enough to search the markets for ingredients he remembered from the game. During the year before leaving his family, he had written down every potion formula his old memory could recover. The difficulty was matching cartoon-like game ingredients with real plants, insects, monster parts, and ancient names used in this earlier era. Even so, he bought suspicious herbs, poisonous flowers, strange animal materials, and a complete set of alchemical equipment. What he wanted most were magic crystals, but public sale of those resources had been banned after a disastrous historical age of crystal warfare. A black market still existed, and Wright quietly acquired a small number through merchants who preferred money over international agreements. Holly then returned with a supply report, so thorough that Wright finally understood how badly he had needed a professional administrator. She had remembered blankets, spare clothes, pack animals, long-term food, replacement tools, and travel arrangements he never would have organized alone. Wright officially hired her, learned she and Ellie had recently been sleeping in a stable, and felt the weight behind her desperate professionalism. At dawn, the new expedition assembled outside Blackstone Fortress with 30 slaves, 5 mercenaries, Holly, Ellie supplies, and one young lord pretending total confidence. Wright appraised the mercenaries and found them competent but ordinary, all hovering near Black Iron, because real-world advancement demanded expensive resources. He studied the slaves' guarded expressions and understood that promises from a new owner meant nothing until behavior proved them true. Ellie hid partly behind Holly's leg, watching Wright with the same careful expression as her mother but far less ability to conceal curiosity. Wright told the group that Golden Domain was poor and unfinished, yet insisted they could someday become proud citizens of something they built together. The speech sounded ambitious enough, but the road ahead remained dangerous long before anyone reached the swamp. Back in Golden Domain, the Lizard Chief was still searching obsessively for a human lord who had already spent days drinking coffee in another city. Ancient tribal knowledge said deed holders suffered terrible luck if they abandoned their land too long, which convinced the chief Wright could not be far away. He did not know the Golden Tree's bond with Wright made the territory continue recognizing its lord as spiritually present. The chief therefore decided Wright must be hiding inside the Ogre Forest and persuaded dozens of warriors to follow him there. He promised that stealing the deed would fill rivers with fish, protect children from hunger, and secure the tribe's future. Desperate warriors believed him and charged into a forest where powerful ogres had no connection whatsoever to Wright's plans. Far away on the return road, Wright enjoyed something he had never experienced in his first life: ordinary travel beneath open stars. Holly handled tents, food, schedules, and inventory, while Wright meditated and learned how little his natural magical talent would help him. Without the Golden Tree, years of training might barely move him through Black Iron, making future growth dependent on rare external advantages. Around the campfire, the mercenaries shared strange stories about creatures, foods, and distant kingdoms the game had never bothered to explain. Wright listened with genuine wonder, because the world had stopped being lore on a screen and become a place he could smell, touch, and explore. That peaceful feeling died when the temperature plunged, the moon blurred, and white fog rolled across the road from every direction. Wright recognized the phenomenon immediately as a history fragment, a rupture created when evil gods distorted reality with pieces of the past. Inside the game, players had treated such fragments as dungeons, but in real life failure meant actual death instead of another attempt. Worse, the phenomenon was appearing earlier than Wright expected, suggesting the world's dark era had begun moving ahead of schedule. Holly clutched sleeping Ellie as the fog swallowed the camp, while Wright ordered everyone to arm themselves with whatever they could carry. The landscape dissolved, then rebuilt itself as the interior of a ruined castle wrapped in supernatural silence. A disembodied announcement identified a historical tragedy involving the vampire Cecilia Ferdinand, betrayal, murder, and flesh-eating transformed residents. Wright nearly smiled despite the danger, because he recognized the Forest Castle dungeon from countless runs in his previous life. He remembered monster locations, passages, shortcuts, and most importantly a route allowing survival without resolving the dungeon's true historical source. The bad news was that this was a level 2 world, where a proper clear normally demanded fighters far stronger than anyone in his caravan. Bronze monsters wandered inside, while Wright's people included slaves, Black Iron mercenaries, one child, and a lord with no attack spell. The good news was that simply escaping the castle could still grant a modest survival reward, and Wright valued survival far above heroic pride. He claimed ancient family texts had taught him about the place, hiding the far less impressive truth that he remembered a game route. Then he imposed strict rules: no talking, no noisy metal equipment, and no hesitation once the group began moving. The mercenaries obeyed first, stripping away metal armor and laying down weapons that could betray the entire group with one careless clang. The goblins and rabbit folk followed more slowly, but Wright's absolute confidence left little room for argument inside a castle filled with unseen predators. Holly looked pained as expensive equipment hit the floor, yet she trusted Wright enough to keep Ellie close and remain silent. Wright moved to the front because the safest route existed inside his memory, and every person behind him now depended on that memory being exact. He guided them through narrow corridors, broken stairways, rooftop gaps, and passages that looked completely wrong to anyone without game knowledge. The caravan moved barefoot or in soft shoes, breathing shallowly while the ruined castle seemed to listen for the smallest mistake. Every turn Wright chose avoided a monster spawn point he had memorized during countless runs in his previous life. His followers gradually relaxed as corridor after corridor remained empty, mistaking practiced route memory for supernatural foresight. Wright kept the same calm expression, even though his heart hammered because one forgotten detail could turn 40 vulnerable people into food. In the game, dying had meant restarting, but here every footstep carried the permanent weight of real bodies and real consequences. They reached the final approach to the sewer exit with no casualties, and Wright could already feel moving air from freedom ahead. Then one mercenary at the rear noticed purple blood grass growing inside a dark side passage, and allowed greed to overpower discipline. The herb was valuable enough to help a black iron fighter approach bronze rank, making it look like a lifetime opportunity lying unattended. He broke formation and rushed toward the plants before Wright could stop him without violating his own rule against sound. A second mercenary followed, unwilling to let his companion claim the entire treasure alone, while everyone else continued toward safety. Wright could only watch them disappear because shouting a warning would draw far worse things toward the entire group. Excited whispers drifted from the side passage, followed by a sudden scream that froze every survivor in place. A bloodhound emerged from the darkness, a massive eyeless red predator built to hunt through sound rather than sight. It seized the first mercenary before he could retreat, and more hounds poured from the shadows toward the second man's panic. The remaining mercenaries looked toward Wright with desperate expressions, silently asking permission to save their companions. Wright refused with one slow shake of his head, because the hounds were bronze threats and a rescue attempt would only multiply the dead. Harold trembled as he watched men he considered brothers vanish beneath the pack, yet he understood exactly why Wright would not sacrifice everyone. Holly covered Ellie's mouth, the slaves crouched together, and not one person dared make another unnecessary sound after witnessing the price of disobedience. Wright resumed moving, forcing grief to wait until the living reached the sewer passage and escaped the ruined castle. The moment they crossed the boundary, an emotionless voice announced that the historical source remained unresolved, but awarded a one-time body enhancement for survival. White fog still surrounded the road outside, yet everyone could suddenly see through it and feel subtle strength spreading through muscles and bones. Harold flexed his hands in disbelief while the other survivors tested bodies that felt lighter, faster, and more responsive than before. Wright explained that they had escaped the history fragment without solving its true tragedy, so the dungeon remained active behind them. Their reward was modest compared with a full clear, but after what they had seen inside, nobody complained about receiving strength merely for surviving. Exhaustion replaced fear once Wright declared the fog zone temporarily safe enough for sleep, and the entire caravan collapsed around the roadside camp. He even skipped a formal night watch because nothing outside could easily cross the fragment's boundary while its source remained alive. Wright fell asleep believing that decision was simple fatigue, while several great goblins interpreted it as another deliberate test of their loyalty. The strongest goblin quietly met with his two blood brothers and touched the slave collar around his neck, while discussing whether this was their best chance to escape. His brothers admitted that most of the other captives no longer wanted to run after watching Wright guide them through the castle alive. During the journey, Wright had promised food, housing, reasonable work, and protection from pointless cruelty, promises slaves usually heard only before being exploited. The dungeon changed those assumptions because Wright had walked at the front, obeyed his own rules, and lost only the two men who abandoned formation. The goblin leader concluded that Wright had intentionally left them unguarded because the surrounding fog made escape impossible and exposed anyone foolish enough to try. In reality, Wright had simply been too exhausted to remember them, but his accidental negligence looked remarkably similar to calculated confidence. The goblins also sensed that the road was leading toward the forest from which ogres had once driven their own people. That history explained another lie surrounding their sale, because the supposed Beast Alliance soldiers were actually refugees captured and mislabeled to raise their price. Wright slept through all of this while his reputation grew without his participation, a pattern that was becoming dangerously useful. Far away inside Golden Domain, the lizard men were suffering from the same reputation for reasons even more absurd. Their chief had led warriors into the forest searching for the human lord he was certain had hidden there after the failed night raid. Instead of finding Wright, they collided with ogres born with supernatural strength and lost a brutal portion of their force. The chief refused to accept that he had simply guessed wrong and decided the ambush had been arranged by an impossibly clever enemy. Every unexplained disaster became proof of Wright's planning, even though Wright was days away and sleeping beside a road. The chief rallied his surviving warriors by insisting the ogres served the human lord, and that defeating them would reveal the land deed's hiding place. His obsession pushed the tribe deeper into a conflict that Wright had neither designed nor even imagined. Meanwhile, history fragments were appearing across the entire continent rather than along one isolated road. White fog swallowed highways, estates, settlements, and military routes as pieces of ancient disasters tore into the present all at once. The Drayton capital mobilized nobles, knights, and officials to map affected zones, rescue civilians, and prevent entire provinces from disappearing into chaos. Even the immortal emperor redirected legions from frontier wars toward the largest fragments, confirming that the world had entered a far more dangerous era. Wright knew none of that yet, because his immediate problem was simply returning home with enough people alive to start building. After resting, his caravan moved again, using the fog behind them as an accidental barrier against Beast Alliance forces traveling the same road. Wright mentally marked the forest castle for a future return when his rank was high enough to clear it properly instead of merely escaping. Back in his territory, the lizard chief discovered a small settlement of tree houses and instantly decided it must be Wright's hidden base. The settlement actually belonged to goblins, while nearby ogres were merely another dangerous part of the forest ecosystem. Facts no longer mattered to a chief who had built his entire strategy around the belief that Wright controlled everything around him. He ordered another night attack, and the result destroyed the remainder of his fighting force while also killing several ogres. When the battle ended, the chief stood among bodies from both sides and opened the largest treehouse expecting evidence of his enemy. Instead, he found terrified goblin children hiding together with no human lord, no secret command post, and no royal deed anywhere nearby. The realization nearly shattered him because he had sacrificed his warriors against a village that had nothing to do with Wright. Desperate for one final direction, he demanded information from the frightened children and accepted the first random path they offered to make him leave. He chased that false trail deeper into the forest, fought another ogre alone, and returned days later with severe internal injuries. By then the tribe had almost no warriors, almost no food, and no realistic way to survive the coming season on its own. The chief finally abandoned his dream of becoming a king and accepted that submission or migration were the only choices left. When his people asked what kind of enemy had destroyed them so completely, he could only describe Wright as unfathomably powerful. The truth was almost insulting, because the supposed mastermind had spent those same days selling fruit, drinking coffee, buying workers, and riding home. Wright eventually reached the familiar swamp with Holly, the slaves, supplies, and the remaining mercenaries still following behind him. Harold completed the escort contract with visible relief, already imagining a safe return to Blackstone and enough alcohol to erase memories of bloodhounds. Wright looked across his difficult land with much greater confidence because this time he had food, tools, seeds, workers, and someone competent enough to remember blankets. He turned toward the caravan and welcomed them to Golden Domain, trying to make the empty horizons sound like the beginning of a real future. The dramatic moment shattered when movement erupted from the swamp, and everyone reached for weapons expecting another lizard attack. Instead, almost 100 lizard men crawled into view and dropped face first into the mud before Wright's caravan. They were not an army but elders, children, injured adults, and starving civilians whose condition revealed how completely the tribe had collapsed. Their wounded chief reached the front, stared at Wright, then at the enormous supply caravan behind him, and finally understood the truth. The human lord had never been hiding in the forest, which meant every disastrous decision the chief had made there belonged entirely to him. The realization hit so hard that he fainted directly into the swamp before he could finish speaking. An older lizard elder stepped forward, because embarrassment mattered less than food when the entire tribe was close to starvation. He formally offered submission to Wright in exchange for survival, promising that the lizard men would serve faithfully if Golden Domain fed them. Wright had no idea why his enemies suddenly looked broken, but he hid every trace of confusion behind a calm expression and noble posture. Sunlight caught his purple hair and red eyes, while the caravan behind him watched the supposed young lord accept surrender like a veteran ruler. The goblin leader was especially stunned, because his people had fought these lizard men over fishing grounds and knew how stubbornly proud they could be. To everyone watching, their surrender proved that Wright had accomplished something terrifying while absent from the territory. To Wright, it proved only that something unbelievably strange had happened while he was away, and he wanted the explanation immediately. He ordered the caravan to rest, then took the elder aside near the swamp where the entire ridiculous story finally came out. Wright listened as the elder described the chief's forest campaign, the ogre ambush, the goblin village attack, the false trail, and the final injury. The more he heard, the harder it became to maintain a dignified face because his enemy had effectively destroyed two hostile groups without Wright lifting a finger. He resisted the urge to laugh and instead explained that the royal land deed could not magically refill a dying swamp or erase the consequences of overfishing. Hunger had made the tribe desperate enough to believe ambition when patience and resource management were what their homeland actually needed. Wright promised that genuine subjects of Golden Domain would receive food, but he made equally clear that every able person would work for that protection. The elder bowed deeply because a stable food supply sounded miraculous after weeks of watching children weaken around an empty swamp. Wright stated that his word as Lord would remain binding, while privately deciding that trust from a neutral tribe would have to be earned over time. He then asked what would happen when the wounded chief finally died, carefully approaching the subject that mattered to the Golden Tree. The elder understood and promised to present the chief's bronze magic crystal as formal proof of submission before giving the body a traditional water burial. That crystal was exactly the resource Wright needed for growth, turning an already unexpected surrender into a major strategic gain. Wright ended the meeting before greed could show on his face and led the caravan around the swamp toward the center of the territory. Everyone followed with growing curiosity until the landscape opened and revealed the magnificent capital they had imagined did not exist. Golden Domain was mostly weeds, uneven ground, empty hills, and the smashed remains of the tiny shack destroyed during the lizard raid. The silence behind Wright became so complete that even he could feel morale collapsing before construction had officially begun. Holly pulled Ellie closer, while the rabbit folk's ears drooped and the goblins stared at a capital consisting largely of grass and broken wood. The mercenaries exchanged the unmistakable looks of men wondering whether they had escorted a noble genius or a beautifully dressed madman. Wright answered the doubt by summoning the royal land deed, drawing thousands of golden sparks from the ground into a glowing document above his hand. The spectacle erased any question about ownership, while Ellie delightedly compared the floating lights to dancing fireflies and broke the oppressive silence. Wright used that opening to explain that every kingdom, fortress, and city had once begun as empty land before someone placed the first stone. He pointed toward weeds and described future wheat fields, then toward scattered rocks and described walls that would someday protect their children. His speech transformed emptiness from evidence of failure into proof that every achievement ahead could belong to the people standing there now. The slaves still looked uncertain, so Wright made the promise that changed the atmosphere far more than any golden document could. He swore that every slave collar under his authority would be removed after 3 years of service. Anyone who remained afterward would own the house built through personal labor and live as a free citizen of Golden Domain. Rabbit ears lifted, goblin faces sharpened, and people who had expected lifelong ownership suddenly saw an end date attached to their chains. Wright immediately assigned work before hope could turn into confusion, sending goblins toward timber and rabbit folk toward clearing usable ground. Holly accepted the impossible settlement as her new responsibility and began organizing labor, supplies, food, sleeping areas, and construction priorities. Ellie adapted even faster, treating the wilderness as an adventure and giving the exhausted adults one small reason to smile. Harold approached to end his escort service, but Wright stopped him with a practical warning about the history fragment still blocking the return road. The mercenary captain remembered the 2 men consumed by bloodhounds and admitted that crossing the castle again could kill the rest of his team. Wright offered another option: permanent employment, reliable monthly pay, and a guarantee that all 3 surviving mercenaries would reach bronze within 1 year. Harold had been trapped at Black Iron Upper for a decade, close enough to true knighthood to understand exactly how enormous that promise was. His talent was not the problem. Advancement potions and materials cost more than years of dangerous mercenary work could easily provide. Wright promised advancement without demanding suicidal obedience, explaining that he wanted partners who fought beside him rather than disposable bodies. Harold accepted almost immediately, and Gordon and Blake followed once the terms were written into a binding contract. Golden Domain now possessed 3 professional guards who believed they had found the opportunity of a lifetime. Wright believed he had acquired experienced security at a bargain, making the agreement satisfying from both directions. Construction turned the empty field into something resembling an ambitious camp, with felled trees, tent rows, frames, and cleared paths appearing by the hour. Wright showed Holly a hand-drawn development plan so abstract that she needed several explanations before recognizing houses, roads, baths, and public toilets. He admitted that shelter came first, because artistic quality mattered less than keeping everyone alive through rain and approaching cold. The chosen settlement site occupied the flattest usable ground near water, with swamp in front, hills to one side, and dangerous forest behind. Holly immediately asked when farming would begin, exposing the uncomfortable fact that stored provisions could not support a growing population forever. Wright told her to focus on buildings because he had prepared a solution for bad farmland long before purchasing the territory. Once everyone was occupied, he quietly slipped toward the hidden golden tree, growing among ordinary autumn foliage. Its small size and seasonal color made excellent camouflage, and Wright planned to surround it eventually with his own manner to protect the secret. He sacrificed several precious bronze magic crystals at the roots, watching them dissolve into glowing energy that the tree absorbed immediately. A new fruit formed above him with the image of a solemn military figure visible inside its golden surface. Appraisal identified it as a heroic spirit fruit connected to LeBron, an ancient figure whose bloodline allowed transformation into an armored giant. Wright recognized the absurd resemblance to stories from his old world and silently appreciated the game's complete lack of shame about inspiration. Heroic spirit fruits granted portions of historical power based on the user's rank, meaning even an incomplete armored giant could become a terrifying battlefield asset. Wright stored the fruit rather than using it himself because his greater advantage came from distributing powers while retaining control through the golden tree. The next days became a contest against weather, hunger, and exhaustion rather than monsters, and Wright discovered that civilization required endless unglamorous details. Roofs leaked, ground turned muddy, tools broke, and every missing routine created another problem Holly had to solve before anyone could rest. Wright prioritized public toilets earlier than several workers expected, because disease could destroy a settlement faster than an enemy raid. Separate waste areas, clean water rules, and basic washing requirements sounded excessive to people accustomed to rough frontier camps. Wright remembered enough modern sanitation to insist anyway, earning confused looks now and potentially saving many lives later. A simple bathhouse followed as soon as labor allowed, improving morale among people who had spent weeks traveling through mud, fog, and monster territory. The goblins proved powerful lumber workers, while rabbit folk handled detailed carpentry and smaller tasks with remarkable speed and precision. Wright watched racial stereotypes from the game transform into real individuals with different tempers, fears, abilities, and levels of trust. That trust was still fragile, because several slaves continued discussing escape whenever they believed no human could hear them. Wright's appraisal skill made those private doubts visible through loyalty values, even when his ears could not catch the conversations themselves. Rather than punish low loyalty, he began searching for the most reliable members of each group and giving them limited responsibility. The great goblin leader who had debated escape now showed growing respect after Wright's behavior in the history fragment and the settlement. Wright promoted him as a work supervisor, a decision the goblin interpreted as proof that the Lord had somehow discovered every secret meeting. The supervisor immediately warned his brothers to stop testing a man who apparently saw through lies without ever confronting them directly. Among the rabbit folk, Wright noticed a quiet female named Tahana whose abilities and loyalty stood far above what her frightened appearance suggested. She had concealed herself carefully among ordinary workers, observing Wright before deciding whether Golden Domain deserved cooperation. Instead of exposing her, Wright assigned her responsibility over the rabbit folk and allowed competence to reveal itself naturally. Tahana accepted with suspicion, then discovered that authority actually meant organizing work, protecting weaker members, and receiving better access to information. The result made Wright look more perceptive than he felt, because both promoted supervisors assumed their hidden qualities had been intentionally identified from the beginning. Wright privately enjoyed the benefit while reminding himself that loyalty numbers were not the same thing as genuine friendship. The surrendered lizard tribe soon became another labor source, though Wright initially kept them separate until food and rules could be established clearly. Their elderly members knew the swamp intimately, while healthier adults understood fishing, reeds, wetland plants, and routes humans would struggle to navigate. Wright exchanged food for labor and information, slowly turning former attackers into residents with practical reasons to support the new lord. The biggest problem remained agriculture because the territory's usable soil could not produce enough ordinary grain before stored supplies disappeared. Wright's solution began with an ugly plant most people considered nearly worthless because its tubers accumulated dangerous poison from certain soils. In his old game knowledge, that same plant could become a massive calorie when cultivated and processed under the right conditions. The royal land deed made the experiment even stronger by preserving fertility and regenerating resources that ordinary farms gradually exhausted. Wright selected a controlled plot, planted the tubers, and used his unimpressive plant growth spell for the first time on a genuinely important project. The magic that had once seemed useless accelerated development enough to turn weeks of waiting into visible progress, before everyone's food anxiety became panic. Holly watched green shoots spread across previously ignored ground and finally understood why Wright had delayed conventional farming. The plants were hardy, productive, and suited to land that would have frustrated more delicate crops, but the poison problem still had to be solved. Wright taught a processing method based on soaking, repeated washing, heat, and careful preparation rather than allowing anyone to eat the harvest directly. He warned that raw tubers were dangerous enough to make an impatient worker seriously ill, forcing Holly to establish strict kitchen control. The first properly processed batch emerged soft, golden, filling, and far better tasting than the skeptical workers expected. People who had been counting remaining grain sacks suddenly saw fields capable of producing dependable food from land they thought useless. Wright named the crop golden potatoes, partly for branding and partly because every successful lord needed to make ordinary logistics sound impressive. The name spread quickly through the settlement, and bowls of steaming potatoes became a visible symbol that Golden Domain might actually survive. Even the lizard men reacted with disbelief because hunger had ruled their swamp for years and the new human lord had created surplus food within weeks. Wright understood that the miracle was mostly remembered game knowledge combined with magical land, but residents saw another impossible demonstration of foresight. Food security changed behavior more effectively than threats, and loyalty values began rising across groups that had once planned to run away. Workers put more effort into houses once they believed they would still be alive and free enough to enjoy those houses 3 years later. Holly's daily reports shifted from emergency shortages toward schedules, inventory, construction targets, and future needs. Wright finally had enough breathing room to pursue another advantage he had carried from his previous life: potion recipes. Before leaving his noble family, he had spent months recording every formula he could remember from the game before details faded from memory. The notes were imperfect because game ingredients had appeared as stylized images while real plants, insects, and monster parts possessed unfamiliar names. Appraisal helped bridge that gap by identifying materials, but each recipe still required careful experimentation to match remembered functions with actual substances. Wright assembled crude alchemy equipment inside a temporary workspace where failure would inconvenience him rather than poison the entire settlement. He began with mixtures simple enough to test safely, measuring reactions while Holly made certain Ellie stayed far away from anything bubbling strangely. Early attempts smelled terrible, changed the wrong colors, or produced useless sludge that proved memory alone could not replace real technique. Wright refused to stop, because even one successful future-era potion could become more valuable than ordinary trade goods produced by the whole territory. His strongest commercial target was a healing medicine known from a later age for effectiveness far beyond anything common in the present era. The recipe depended on materials available now, which meant the advantage came not from rare ingredients, but from knowledge centuries ahead of local alchemists. Wright adjusted temperatures, crushing methods, order of mixing, and magical control while recording every failed result for comparison. The work demanded more patience than combat because an enemy could be shot, while an unstable potion simply punished sloppy thinking without explaining why. Several batches failed completely before one mixture finally settled into the pale luminous appearance Wright remembered from the game. Appraisal confirmed that he had produced Moonlight Tears, a healing potion with quality high enough to matter in real emergencies. The achievement opened a second path to wealth because medicine could be sold repeatedly without revealing the golden tree or sacrificing another unique fruit. Wright also realized that reliable healing would protect his own people as battles became inevitable around an isolated frontier territory. He guarded the formula carefully, allowing only the finished potion to become visible while the exact process remained his personal secret. Holly understood enough economics to recognize that a portable, repeatable, high-value product could transform Golden Domain's finances. Wright understood something even more important. Money earned from knowledge could fund the military strength needed to keep that knowledge from being stolen. The settlement had begun with corpses, empty grass, and a frightened collection of strangers, yet it now possessed food, shelter, labor, and a valuable product. None of those gains made Golden Domain safe, but for the first time Wright had enough foundations to prepare for the enemies that would eventually notice it. Wright spent the next several days refining Moonlight Tears with the obsession of someone who knew the finished product belonged centuries ahead of contemporary medicine. He burned through ingredients, repeated failures, and ignored ordinary routines until Holly had to carry meals into the laboratory just to keep him functioning. By the end of a week, his hair was wild, his clothes were wrinkled, and the outside world felt less familiar than the rows of bottles around him. Then one crystal vial finally held liquid like melted emerald, and appraisal confirmed perfect quality moonlight tears. Wright valued that tiny bottle more than his exhausted appearance because it proved future knowledge could be converted into repeatable wealth. While he had been isolated with alchemy equipment, Holly had transformed the settlement through disciplined schedules and relentless organization. Golden Domain now possessed proper public toilets, clear usage rules, and enough routine that even goblins and lizard men were slowly adapting to sanitation. Rabbit folk embraced privacy immediately, adding simple partitions and making the rough facilities look more civilized than Wright expected. A permanent tool shed came next, with marked locations for axes, sickles, saws, and other equipment that had previously vanished whenever someone needed it. Wright considered that simple organization a genuine technological breakthrough, because it saved labor every morning without consuming magic or money. The bathhouse became even more popular, offering heated water to people who had spent most of their lives washing only in rivers. Goblins discovered that cleanliness was unexpectedly pleasant. Rabbit folk treated warm baths like luxury, and lizard men stubbornly insisted cold water protected their scales. Housing improved into double-walled wooden structures packed with insulating material, plain but sturdy enough to survive the approaching winter. Wright knew brick buildings would replace them eventually, yet survival mattered more than appearance while the settlement was still fragile. Harvest day finally arrived for the golden potatoes, and Holly brought Ellie to drag Wright away from his laboratory long enough to watch. The planting field looked almost barren above ground, because the aggressive crop had consumed surrounding weeds and concentrated growth beneath the soil. Workers dug cautiously until the first enormous purple tuber rolled free, several times larger than an ordinary potato. More followed with every strike of a hoe until the field revealed enough food to create a small mountain in the middle of camp. Tahana and the other rabbit folks stared, because a crop that productive could support families on land everyone had dismissed as worthless. Holly immediately organized sorting, setting aside spotted tubers for seed and keeping edible harvests separate from anything intended for replanting. Processing remained strict because the crop's old reputation as poison soil potatoes had been earned through careless preparation. Workers washed, boiled, peeled, and mashed each batch before transforming it into warm golden flatbread that smelled far better than frontier rations. Harold tested the food carefully, found no toxic effect, and then admitted it tasted better than expensive wheat bread he remembered from major cities. Goblins abandoned dignity almost immediately, competing for extra servings while lizard men tasted sweetness and softness far beyond their usual swamp fish. Some former starving enemies became emotional over something as simple as a potato cake, revealing how deep hunger had shaped their lives. Even cautious Tahana began eating faster, with every bite while pretending that nobody could see how happily her ears reacted. Ellie asked whether food this good would always exist in their new home, and Wright promised that the future menu would become better rather than worse. That evening, Lauder traveled through the settlement in a way Wright had never heard since claiming the territory. Golden Domain finally sounded less like a temporary labor camp and more like a place where people expected to wake up tomorrow. Escape discussions weakened as full stomachs, private rewards, and visible progress gave workers more to lose by disappearing into dangerous wilderness. Tahana still suspected Wright was deliberately dividing rabbit folk unity when high-loyalty workers received better rooms and responsibilities. The great goblin leader reached the same conclusion after his loudest brothers earned private housing while he remained in communal quarters. Wright had no sophisticated conspiracy behind those decisions. He simply rewarded the people whose appraisal numbers showed the strongest commitment. To everyone else, that spreadsheet-like method looked like precise political manipulation performed by a lord who always knew where loyalty truly rested. Roughly 1 month after the settlement began stabilizing, the lizard elder arrived with news of armed human riders approaching from beyond the swamp. 14 cavalrymen had crossed difficult terrain around the history fragment, which meant they had invested far too much effort to be casual travelers. Wright immediately ordered workers toward defensive positions, sent Holly and Ellie indoors, and took Harold, Gordon, and Blake toward higher ground. The riders stopped outside the settlement, while a robed mage used long-range detection to measure the supernatural strength waiting inside. The golden tree concealed Wright's own aura completely, so enemy scanning made the Lord appear like an ordinary human surrounded by only 3 black iron mercenaries. That false weakness encouraged the riders, whose leader sent 3 scouts forward to confirm whether Golden Domain could be robbed safely. Wright used appraisal and saw loyalty values below neutrality, a clear sign that the approaching men already intended violence regardless of whatever story they told. Their spokesman pretended to be a lost knight serving a noble household, But Wright recognized the pattern of professional raiders hunting isolated border lords. He allowed the three men close enough to become committed, then turned the encounter from polite deception into an ambush of his own. The seed green frog appeared through the golden tree's retained power while Wright's pistols covered the directions the scouts might use to escape. Razor leaves tore through one rider before he could signal the distant group, and gunfire forced the others into a fight they had expected to control. Wright killed all three scouts quickly because allowing even one to return would give the main raiders accurate information about his hidden abilities. Their leader waited for a signal that never came, and uncertainty began replacing confidence among the 11 men still positioned outside. Wright knew they would eventually attack anyway, so he prepared Golden Domain for a battle that could not be avoided with negotiation. The LeBron heroic spirit fruit suddenly became more valuable than any auction price because Harold was the strongest loyal fighter available to receive it. Wright refused to hand over such an impossible object casually, knowing mystery could protect the golden tree better than technical explanations ever could. He summoned Harold privately and framed the fruit as a sacred blessing connected to the hidden divine heritage of the Louiswas family. Harold had spent a decade unable to cross into bronze, so the possibility of receiving power from his lord carried almost religious weight. Wright staged a nightly ceremony with solemn language, a drawn sword, and controlled golden light from a modified illumination spell. A drop of blood and carefully timed sleight of hand made the heroic fruit appear as though Wright had created it through his own mysterious bloodline. Harold accepted the performance completely because everything he had witnessed since meeting Wright made impossible explanations feel increasingly believable. He ate the fruit, and supernatural force flooded through a body that had already reached the edge of black iron potential. Harold broke into bronze rank, finally becoming the true knight he had chased through years of dangerous mercenary work. More importantly, the heroic spirit gave him access to the armored giant transformation stored inside the fruit. Wright had fulfilled his promise far earlier than the one-year contract required, pushing Harold's loyalty from professional respect toward personal devotion. The transformation also changed the tactical balance, because 11 raiders were no longer approaching a camp protected only by ordinary mercenaries. Wright still faced another problem. Most of his defenders wore slave collars and might reasonably refuse to risk their lives for the man who owned them. Rather than command unwilling bodies into combat, he gathered the goblins and rabbit folk before the raiders launched their main attack. Then he removed every collar immediately instead of waiting for the 3-year freedom promise to expire. The gesture shocked the settlement because Wright was surrendering legal control at the exact moment he most needed numbers on his side. He told the newly freed workers that anyone who wanted safety could leave, while anyone who stayed would fight as a citizen defending a future that now belonged partly to them. The choice transformed the meaning of the coming battle from protecting a master into protecting homes, food, friends, and promised property. Nobody ran, not because the wilderness was easy, but because Golden Domain had become more valuable than the uncertain freedom waiting outside it. Goblins armed themselves, rabbit folk prepared tools and weapons, and the lizard tribe joined because losing Wright would also mean losing the food system keeping them alive. Wright distributed steam handguns where possible, relying on concentrated volleys to compensate for defenders who lacked supernatural strength. The remaining raiders finally advanced after concluding that their missing scouts had been delayed or killed by resistance too weak to threaten the full group. Their confidence lasted until organized gunfire erupted from the settlement and forced mounted attackers to break formation under unfamiliar weapons. Harold stepped forward at bronze rank, making the raiders realize too late that their earlier magical scan had become dangerously outdated. When stronger enemies tried to overwhelm him, Harold triggered the heroic spirit and disappeared inside a burst of steam. His body expanded into an armored giant whose size alone shattered every assumption the raiders had made about the frontier lord. The transformed Harold struck with strength far beyond a newly advanced knight, turning cavalry mobility into a liability against enormous reach. Riders scattered while Wright coordinated gunfire rather than charging recklessly into a battle his physical rank still could not dominate alone. The enemy mage attempted to stabilize the raider line and use supernatural attacks from a safer distance. Lizard fighters who knew the wetlands better than any outsider moved through concealed routes and reached the mage from an angle the cavalry had ignored. His death removed the raiders' best source of ranged magical control and pushed the surviving attackers toward panic. Harold's giant form broke their remaining cohesion, while defenders attacked individuals instead of allowing the cavalry to reorganize. The raiders who had crossed mountains expecting an undefended prize found themselves trapped between firearms, local ambushes, and a giant knight. Golden Domain won decisively, although Wright treated the victory as proof that preparation mattered more than assuming future enemies would be equally careless. The bodies supplied weapons, armor, horses, equipment, and supernatural materials that a young settlement could never have afforded to purchase easily. Wright recovered magic crystals from ranked enemies and carried them toward the Golden Tree, with the satisfaction of converting invasion into development resources. The tree absorbed new energy and produced another fruit, this time linked to the stealth-focused Darkstalker class. Wright also felt his own power surge as the Golden Tree strengthened him enough to cross into Bronze Lower. For the first time, the Lord himself stood at the rank considered a genuine knight, or mage rather than an unusually equipped apprentice. His new statistics mattered, but the larger victory was psychological, because every group in the settlement had fought on the same side voluntarily. Freed rabbit folk did not disappear after the danger passed, and the goblins who once planned escape returned directly to work and repairs. The lizard men saw that Wright's promises of food and protection survived actual combat rather than existing only in peaceful speeches. Harold regarded his giant power as sacred proof that loyalty to Wright could change the limits imposed on a person's entire life. Wright understood the actual mechanism, yet he allowed the divine interpretation to continue, because secrecy around the Golden Tree protected everyone. The surviving residents began calling fruit users blessed in language that sounded increasingly religious despite Wright never creating an official faith. He privately accepted the useful misunderstanding, while making sure practical rewards still depended on work rather than worship. Looted horses improved transportation, captured equipment strengthened guards, and raider wealth funded projects delayed by the settlement's earlier poverty. The battle also taught Wright that Golden Domain needed a repeatable system for training ordinary citizens, instead of depending entirely on rare Golden Tree fruits. He returned to game knowledge, advancement recipes, and martial manuals as the next tools for turning laborers into a population capable of defending itself. Victory had ended one threat, but it also proved that the isolated territory was now valuable enough for outsiders to cross mountains trying to seize it. Wright intended to make the next group regret that calculation even faster, which meant building strength before another enemy appeared. The frontier settlement had survived its first organized human raid, and every survivor now understood that Golden Domain was becoming something worth fighting for. The battle left Harold unconscious from his first giant transformation, but the goblins carried him home with astonishing care despite hands built for heavy labor. Gordon and Blake quietly concluded that Harold's impossible new bloodline had come from Wright's golden fruit rather than any ancestry the mercenary captain had hidden. Both men decided they wanted a future in Golden Domain, where loyalty had already turned one ordinary fighter into something capable of crushing a bronze enemy. Rabbit folk moved across the battlefield with ruthless efficiency, collecting weapons, coins, armor pieces, and anything else useful enough to strengthen the settlement. Tahana supervised the work so thoroughly that Wright became impressed by people he had originally purchased only for skilled manual labor. The lizard elder approached with the fallen mage's crystal and a dramatic declaration that the swamp's children now belonged to Golden Domain. Wright's appraisal still showed the elder as cautious rather than devoted, revealing that the old reptile had chosen the safest moment possible to demonstrate usefulness. Instead of resenting that calculation, Wright respected it because practical self-interest could become dependable loyalty when both sides continued benefiting. He rewarded the lizard tribe with extra rations, reinforcing the simple lesson that useful cooperation produced visible advantages. The collected bronze crystals went directly to the Golden Tree, where their energy disappeared into the roots and triggered another fruit. This fruit was black rather than gold and belonged to the Darkstalker profession, a stealth-focused class built around concealment and assassination. Wright stored it for a future follower whose abilities and loyalty matched the class, rather than wasting a rare power on the first willing volunteer. The Golden Tree's growth also flooded Wright with energy until his own rank finally advanced from Black Iron into Bronze Lower. The difference was immediate, sharpening his body and expanding magical reserves enough to make his previous state feel fragile by comparison. Wright had entered the first rank treated as genuine supernatural power, even though his strongest advantages still came from knowledge, preparation, and borrowed fruit abilities. Holly completed the post-battle accounting and revealed that the defeated raiders had carried anonymous bank checks worth a substantial fortune. The settlement also recovered living warhorses, usable steel weapons, healing supplies, armor, and a martial training manual from the dead attackers. The most valuable written prize was the Windhawk breathing method, a technique capable of developing agility and supporting advancement far beyond beginner levels. Wright compared it with the mediocre inherited methods available to his noble family, and immediately recognized a training resource worth more than its paper. That night, Residents celebrated around a fire while meat roasted, rabbit folk danced, goblins shouted, and former strangers acted like people who had survived together. Holly observed that nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore, and Wright could see the same change through loyalty values that had risen across the camp. Tahana's change mattered most, because she had spent weeks expecting betrayal from another human owner and preparing her people for eventual escape. During the defense, Wright had trusted her with a firearm despite knowing she could theoretically turn it against him. She had not, and after seeing every collar removed before the battle, her old image of Wright as a disguised captor became harder to maintain. By the end of the celebration, Tahana no longer looked like someone waiting for the nearest opening to run. The next morning, Harold appeared before Wright with a new problem that surprised both of them more than the giant transformation itself. A small glowing point had appeared in Harold's vision, identical to the interface trigger Wright recognized from his own player system. Wright instructed him to open his personal attributes, and a translucent panel materialized with statistics, rank, abilities, and inventory information. Eating a golden tree fruit had not merely granted a class, it had converted Harold into something resembling a player inside a world full of ordinary inhabitants. Harold could now inspect his own strength, constitution, agility, fighting spirit, and progress toward future advancement with impossible precision. He also possessed a personal inventory large enough to store equipment without carrying it physically, an ability worth fortunes in a society where spatial artifacts were rare. Harold interpreted the interface as further proof of Wright's divine bloodline, while Wright carefully avoided correcting a misunderstanding protecting the golden tree's true origin. The simplified system lacked Wright's appraisal of other people and offered less storage, confirming that fruit users received powerful but incomplete versions of his privileges. Wright found the development fascinating because a former game character now possessed mechanics normally reserved for players. Harold's training became brutally efficient once numerical feedback showed exactly where his strength improved and how much effort each session produced. Wright ordered him to practice the armored giant transformation repeatedly, turning combat training into free construction at the same time. Each enormous transformation flattened rough ground, crushed brush, and broke apart obstacles that would have consumed days of ordinary labor. Rabbit folk followed behind every session to clear debris and prepare newly leveled soil for future fields. Golden Domain's agricultural plan expanded beyond potatoes toward vegetables and wheat as soon as enough flat land and irrigation became available. Freedom created a new economic problem, because Wright no longer wanted to feed every citizen indefinitely without any system connecting work to rewards. His answer was a point economy where labor earned credits that could be exchanged for food, better housing, useful goods, and eventually supernatural training. The captured wind hawk method, Harold's basic martial technique, and Wright's family meditation method became some of the most desirable rewards in the new system. Ordinary humanoids could learn foundational cultivation, then use appropriate potions to awaken supernatural circuits instead of relying entirely on birth or luck. That possibility changed labor from compulsory survival into personal advancement, and productivity rose because workers were building power for themselves. The goblin supervisors and rabbit folk leaders valued training manuals especially highly because accidental awakening had already shown them how much supernatural strength changed a life. Wright planned to add black iron advancement potions once his alchemy became reliable enough to produce them without wasting scarce ingredients. The point system also prevented favoritism from becoming arbitrary, because residents could see exactly which tasks earned which rewards. Golden Domain was still small, but it now had the beginnings of wages, property expectations, public services, military training, and social mobility. Wright spent much of the following month back inside the laboratory, producing rows of perfect moonlight tiers while the settlement operated without constant supervision. The glowing medicine represented a fortune sitting on shelves, yet stored wealth meant little if nobody converted it into money, supplies, and rare ingredients. Wright needed Blackstone Fortress markets, but leaving personally felt increasingly dangerous with winter approaching and surviving ogres still somewhere inside the forest. He could not protect the territory, manage construction, experiment with alchemy, and travel for trade at the same time. Holly entered while he considered the problem and suggested something Wright had not fully accepted yet. The settlement no longer depended on him for every task. She had already managed logistics, budgets, food, housing, labor schedules, and purchases more effectively than Wright could have done alone. More importantly, she had discovered that Tahana possessed an exceptional memory capable of reproducing the dangerous forest castle route almost perfectly. Holly had tested her with specific turns and landmarks from their previous escape, and the rabbit leader matched details well enough to guide another crossing. That meant a small team could travel to Blackstone Fortress, while Wright remained in Golden Domain to handle threats and development. Harold offered strength and his new inventory, Holly offered negotiation and logistics, and Tahana offered root memory plus the quiet abilities. Wright still suspected she was hiding. Wright realized that sending 3 capable people also demonstrated trust, something he had repeatedly demanded from followers while keeping too much responsibility for himself. He decided the team would sell moonlight tiers, purchase supplies, locate rare alchemy ingredients, and return without hauling obvious cargo across dangerous roads. Harold's player inventory allowed valuable bottles to disappear from sight, reducing both transportation burden and the chance of attracting thieves. Wright prepared 100 perfect moonlight tiers for the trip, enough merchandise to test the market without exposing the entire stockpile. He also wrote a detailed shopping list based on recipes that could not progress with the materials currently available in Golden Domain. Holly reviewed the list like a professional quartermaster, adding ordinary necessities Wright would probably have forgotten while thinking only about magical ingredients. Wright spent several evenings comparing the new economy with the settlement's earlier dependence on direct ration distribution and found behavior changing quickly. Workers who once measured time by meals now measured it by the points separating them from a better room, a manual, or future supernatural advancement. The change reduced the need for constant supervision because personal goals pushed people to finish assigned work without Holly chasing every group. Second Bro became even more aggressive as a supervisor once his own advancement dreams depended on measurable productivity rather than vague promises. Big Bro also stopped talking about returning to the forest because the destroyed Goblin homeland offered less future than the training opportunities growing here. Rabbit folk who had feared permanent slavery now discussed which manuals they would buy after earning enough points as free residents. Tahana remained one of the quietest workers, but Wright noticed that her loyalty no longer dipped whenever human guards entered the same area. The social shift mattered, because Golden Domain could not become a functioning territory if every species treated every other species as a temporary threat. Wright still expected conflict eventually, yet shared work, shared defense, and shared rewards were creating habits stronger than speeches alone. At the same time, his laboratory shelves continued filling with perfect moonlight tiers that the local population could never consume fast enough. Each bottle used common materials but represented healing quality unavailable in the current era, making the stockpile far more valuable in a major fortress market. Wright calculated that selling even part of the supply could fund rare ingredients, construction tools, winter reserves, and future military equipment. The problem remained transportation, because a large visible shipment would attract thieves while Wright himself could not safely abandon the territory for another long journey. Harold's new player inventory solved most of the cargo problem by hiding bottles in personal storage that no ordinary search could discover. What Wright still needed was someone who could negotiate without being dazzled by merchants, remember every necessary purchase, and cross the history fragment safely. Holly fit the first 2 requirements better than anyone, having already proved that she could manage contracts and logistics with almost frightening precision. She also surprised Wright by arguing that he had become too protective of responsibilities his followers were now capable of handling themselves. Golden Domain would never grow beyond one man's reach if the Lord personally performed every trade trip, purchase, defense decision, and supply negotiation. Holly offered to lead the mission to Blackstone Fortress herself, using Harold as protection and his inventory as invisible cargo space. Wright's immediate objection was the Forest Castle route because one wrong corridor inside that persistent history fragment could kill the entire trade team. Holly answered with information she had quietly verified instead of relying on optimism. Tahana possessed an unusually precise memory and could reproduce the path Wright had used through the castle during their first escape. Holly had tested her repeatedly with corridor order, wall crossings, turns, and landmarks that ordinary travelers would have forgotten after one terrifying passage. Tahana's answers matched Holly's own memory closely enough that the butler trusted her to guide a small group along the same silent route. Wright reconsidered the plan, because 3 fast riders would attract less attention than a caravan and could move far more quickly between danger zones. Harold would provide bronze combat strength, Holly would control money and negotiations, and Tahana would provide navigation through the castle. The combination also kept Golden Domain's lord at home where the land deed, golden tree, and growing population depended on his presence most. Wright prepared 100 perfect moonlight tiers for the mission and transferred them into Harold's hidden inventory rather than physical crates. He added a detailed list of rare alchemy ingredients, replacement materials, and ordinary supplies that would support the settlement through further expansion. Holly reviewed the list and immediately added practical items Wright had overlooked, reminding him again why he had hired a professional household manager. The mission would also test whether Golden Domain could conduct external trade through trusted representatives instead of exposing Wright every time money changed hands. If successful, that arrangement could become a permanent system connecting the remote territory to Blackstone Fortress without slowing construction at home. Wright approved the concept but refused to assume Tahana would accept the dangerous role merely because Holly had discovered her memory talent. He wanted her agreement directly, especially because the rabbit leader had only recently begun treating Golden Domain as more than a temporary refuge. Wright therefore sent word asking Tahana to meet him privately before the trade team's final departure preparations. When the rabbit leader arrived, Wright was ready to ask whether her remarkable memory could guide Holly and Harold safely back through the forest castle. Tahana entered Wright's office still cautious, but far less guarded than the rabbit leader who had once planned to vanish at the first opportunity. Wright asked whether she could truly memorize the castle route, and Tahana answered with quiet pride that detailed memory had always been one of her greatest strengths. When he proposed sending her with Holly and Harold to Blackstone Fortress, Tahana hesitated because the journey offered a chance to ask for something enormous. Her original tribe had numbered nearly 300 rabbit folk before supposed allies from the Beast Alliance betrayed them. Many elders, children, and weak members had been killed during that betrayal, while the survivors were sold through multiple slave networks. More than 50 of Tahana's remaining people were still imprisoned inside Blackstone Fortress, waiting for buyers who could scatter them permanently. She asked Wright to purchase everyone he could find, even though the total cost would consume roughly 600,000 nars. Tahana dropped to her knees and offered lifelong loyalty in exchange, not for personal power, but for a chance to reunite her shattered people. Wright lifted her back to her feet and told her that fighting for one's people was something a leader should stand proudly for rather than beg over. He agreed to authorize Holly to buy the captives, with one condition that Tahana would keep the newcomers disciplined as citizens instead of allowing disorder. Relief broke through Tahana's composure, and her loyalty jumped high enough to match Harold's respectful commitment. That change gave Wright another reason to choose her for the black darkstalker fruit he had been saving. He turned the transfer into another nightly ceremony, partly for secrecy and partly because grand rituals were becoming unexpectedly useful political tools. Tahana swore eternal loyalty to Wright Lewis and Golden Domain by the honor of the rabbit folk. Candlelight filled the rough wooden room, while Wright touched a sword to her shoulders and completed a ceremony more important than the building around it suggested. He repeated the illusion of divine creation, combining a drop of blood with golden light before producing the darkstalker fruit from his inventory. Tahana ate without hesitation, and energy surged through her white fur until every strand stood rigid before settling into controlled power. Her rank climbed from black iron lower to black iron upper, placing the rabbit assassin only one major step beneath true knight-level strength. More surprising, the fruit awakened a magical circuit alongside her existing fighting spirit, violating one of the world's supposedly absolute laws. People were believed capable of following either the magic path or the martial path, never both, yet Tahana now carried power from each. The golden tree had ignored that restriction completely, turning a naturally stealthy rabbit into a supernatural anomaly. Tahana embraced the same golden blessed explanation Harold already believed, interpreting the impossible change as evidence that Wright's bloodline carried divine favor. Wright saw no reason to correct a story that protected the tree and made his gifts easier for loyal followers to understand. Her player panel appeared as expected, granting personal storage, visible statistics, and a new talent tree linked directly to the Darkstalker profession. Wright instructed her to spend the first points on breath concealment, facelessness, and shadow killing, abilities that perfectly matched rabbit folk's senses and natural stealth. Breath concealment erased her presence from supernatural detection, while facelessness made observers struggle to retain a clear memory of her identity. Shadow Kill gave her a direct magical attack capable of strangling targets through their own darkness, without obvious physical contact. The knowledge entered her mind instantly rather than through study, proving the fruit system could install skills as easily as a game menu. Tahana vanished from the room so quietly after the ceremony that Wright almost missed her departure, which he considered an excellent first test. His own panel revealed another advantage. Giving away a fruit also unlocked that fruit's associated skill path for the Golden Tree's master. Wright now possessed the same Darkstalker options while keeping his stronger inventory, appraisal, and broader player functions. He noticed the trees still lacked mature, natural-type fruits capable of elemental transformations, a reminder that his greatest rewards remained far in the future. For now, patience mattered more than fantasies of becoming fire, lightning, or some other overwhelming endgame form. Wright loaded 100 perfect moonlight tears into Harold's inventory and handed Holly a detailed list of rare alchemy ingredients to purchase. Because player storage hid cargo completely, 3 riders could carry merchandise worth a fortune without pack animals or visible wagons attracting thieves. Holly, Harold, and Tahana prepared to travel light and fast, leaving Wright behind to manage Golden Domain during winter preparations. Holly placed Ellie in Wright's care for the trip, apologizing for the energetic child while Ellie immediately insisted she would cause absolutely no trouble. Wright accepted the responsibility gladly, having grown attached to the girl whose uncomplicated trust often softened the harshest days of territorial management. Tahana gave her people final orders to work, obey the settlement's rules, and wait for her return with the rabbit folk still trapped in slavery. Wright watched the 3 riders disappear toward the fog route, then turned his attention toward the forest where another unresolved danger still lived. The late lizard chief had killed many ogres during his disastrous campaign, but enough remained to threaten logging camps once winter reduced wild food. Wright refused to hunt them deep among trees where their size, strength, and familiarity with the forest would erase many of his advantages. Instead, he posted lizard sentries near the logging areas with simple orders to report anything enormous and ugly rather than attempting heroics. That evening, Second Bro surprised Big Bro by suggesting the goblins should stop talking about returning to their ruined old settlement. Food, beds, private rooms, the point system, and access to breathing techniques had made Golden Domain more promising than a forest filled with graves. Rumors that Tahana had received a golden blessing made the offer even harder to ignore, especially for supernatural refugees trapped without proper training. Third Bro openly declared he wanted the same blessing someday, partly so he could personally crush the ogres responsible for destroying their people. Big Bro finally accepted that the old village was gone, and that revenge would be better pursued from a growing territory than from homelessness. The Goblin Escape Committee effectively dissolved, replaced by the far more motivating dream of becoming strong enough to settle old debts. Wright had discovered a simple formula for refugee loyalty without ever formally articulating it: food, dignity, hope, and a believable path toward power. The next day tested that loyalty immediately, because trouble arrived almost as soon as Harold and Tahana were too far away to help. Deep in the forest, 11 surviving ogres woke hungry after stripping their old territory of available food. An ancient goblin shaman emerged among them and revealed that these monsters were not wandering independently. He had somehow brought them under his control. The shaman ordered them to wait for the coming full moon, promising a blessing that would strengthen them before attacking the settlement outside the trees. When an ogre complained of hunger, the old goblin simply promised another tribe could be fed to them first. Wright knew none of this while Gordon and Blake stood guard near the fields discussing when their own golden fruits might finally arrive. Their conversation ended when black shapes appeared on the horizon in numbers far too large for another casual raider band. The approaching force consisted of roughly 120 dogfolk soldiers from the Beast Alliance, survivors of a military unit scattered by history fragments. Weeks of wandering had left them starving, exhausted, and willing to seize food from anything standing between them and survival. Gordon counted supernatural auras among the formation and ran back with a report far worse than the earlier cavalry raid. At least 6 dogfolk carried bronze-level power, including a stronger captain, while several additional soldiers stood at Black Iron. Wright appraised from concealment and confirmed the threat. One organized military unit could overwhelm Golden Domain in a straightforward battle. Dogfolk and humans had fought for generations, leaving little reason to expect surrender terms or mercy if the soldiers discovered a human lord. With Harold, Tahana, and Holly absent, Wright dismissed the idea of a head-on fight before pride could turn calculation into suicide. He instead began building a plan around the enemy's most obvious weakness, one more powerful than any rank difference. They were desperately hungry. Scouts from the dogfolk found recently cultivated ground but only manure and recovering soil where the latest golden potato cycle had ended. The hungry soldiers were so desperate that some examined the foul fertilizer, as though it might contain something edible. Another scout soon located Golden Domain's visible settlement, where goblins and rabbit folk moved without collars and no humans appeared in sight. The dogfolk captain assumed he had found an undefended village full of weak prey and led the entire unit forward to seize supplies. Old Tahu stepped out as the trembling representative, exactly as Wright's plan required. The captain demanded every scrap of food and threatened to eat the residents themselves if the village resisted. Tahu allowed one nervous glance to flick toward the granary door, a movement small enough to look accidental but obvious enough for a bully to notice. The captain immediately ordered the building opened, and a flood of raw purple gold tubers rolled into view. Tahu begged them not to take the supposed winter reserve, making the dogfolk even more convinced they had discovered the settlement's most precious food. What they did not know was that every genuinely useful supply had already been moved elsewhere before their arrival. The granary existed as bait, packed almost entirely with unprocessed golden potatoes that remained poisonous until prepared by Wright's special method. Safe preparation required boiling with the proper vines, peeling, mashing, and finishing the food carefully enough to remove the last toxins. Hungry soldiers roasting raw tubers directly over campfires would receive none of those protections. Tahu's frightened glance, desperate pleading, and shaking ears therefore served as deliberate stagecraft rather than a failed attempt to hide the trap. The dogfolk captain saw helpless refugees and free food, exactly the picture Wright needed arrogance to create. Soldiers tore through the granary, roasted the tubers without washing or processing them, and celebrated the sweet smell of what they thought was salvation. Even Wright, hidden at a distance, found the aroma tempting despite knowing the meal would soon become a battlefield weapon. Tahu remembered Beast Alliance soldiers stealing his family's migration food years earlier under the same language of military necessity. His parents had starved afterward, making this deception more than obedience to Wright. It was a chance to answer an old wound without open combat. By nightfall, the dogfolk occupied the houses, laughed around fires, and praised their luck after forcing the residents to leave. Then the poison reached full effect and celebration turned into screaming as stomachs twisted and soldiers collapsed across the ground. Wright's original plan was simple: wait for the military unit to weaken, then strike the survivors with concentrated force. That plan ceased belonging to him when massive footsteps sounded from the forest and 11 ogres entered the poisoned camp. Behind them came the ancient goblin shaman, invoking a forbidden god of gluttony and treating the helpless dog folk as a promised feast. Wright had no idea such a cultist lived in his forest, no idea the ogres were controlled, and no idea a full moon ritual was about to begin. Gordon and Blake stared at the arriving monsters and assumed the entire sequence had been part of their lord's strategy from the beginning. Wright responded with his calmest mysterious smile while internally wondering why every accident in Golden Domain insisted on improving his reputation. Ogres crashed through the poisoned formation like siege engines, throwing soldiers aside and biting into bodies while many victims could barely stand. Ordinary dogfolk were far smaller, and even trained supernatural warriors struggled against monsters strengthened by the shaman's dark blessing. Wounds that should have disabled the ogres failed to slow them, and the creatures kept eating as if pain no longer reached their minds. Some wounds regenerated grotesquely, with flesh expanding into new shapes that made the battle look less natural with every passing minute. The shaman believed divine providence had weakened his enemies, never realizing Wright's poisoned food had prepared the victims before the ogres arrived. As more dogfolk died, the monsters grew increasingly distorted, their mouths widening and swollen bodies repairing damage at impossible speed. The captain attempted to retreat only to slam into an invisible barrier sealing the entire settlement from escape. The old goblin revealed himself openly as an evil god worshipper and announced that every creature inside the barrier had become part of his sacrifice. Wright understood the danger immediately, because the world's recognized religions treated outside gods as catastrophic threats rather than harmless alternative faiths. Official churches served deities of law, nature, war, holy light, night, sea, chaos, and the widely revered power behind steam and machinery. Cultists devoted to forbidden beings regularly performed sacrifices and transformations so extreme that ordinary political conflicts became irrelevant beside them. The shaman had apparently been trapped at Bronze Upper for years, and turned to the god of gluttony for a shortcut into silver. His ritual demanded monsters that had each consumed enormous numbers of intelligent beings, so he had spent years feeding goblins to his captive ogres. The late lizard chief's accidental war had nearly ruined that preparation by killing much of the ogre group before the ceremony could occur. Tonight, however, poisoned dogfolk provided the final helpless victims the shaman needed under the full moon. One by one, bronze dogfolk were overwhelmed and consumed while the barrier prevented retreat and the cultist watched his plan mature. When the last major resistance disappeared, the shaman began chanting and black symbols moved across every surviving ogre's skin. All 11 monsters froze, melted into streams of dark liquid, and flowed toward the old god like sacrifices returning to a single vessel. Each absorbed body pushed his aura higher until bronze upper pressure began breaking toward the threshold of silver. Gordon and Blake wanted to attack before the breakthrough completed, terrified that waiting even seconds would create an enemy beyond their ability to handle. Wright refused because the barrier remained active and a defensive mage approaching Silver inside prepared territory would be extremely difficult to kill. He had noticed something more useful. Completing the breakthrough required the shaman to draw every part of his concentration inward. The same instant would force him to drop the ceiling barrier and temporarily abandon the defensive spells that made a mage dangerous. Wright therefore waded through the most frightening part of the ritual, gambling that arrogance would create a cleaner opening than panic ever could. Silver pressure finally erupted across the clearing, and the old goblin began celebrating the achievement he had sacrificed years and countless lives to reach. The barrier vanished exactly as Wright predicted, leaving the new silver mage focused on triumph instead of the battlefield around him. Wright's first bullet struck the back of the shaman's skull before the victory speech had even finished. More pistol fire followed immediately, forcing the confused cultist to turn toward enemies he had never realized were waiting outside the ritual. Behind Wright, organized rows of goblins and rabbit folk raised steam handguns and fired together at the unprotected silver mage. Nobody attempted a fair duel, because fairness would only give a superior spellcaster time to restore barriers and turn the clearing into a graveyard. Repeated volleys tore through the shaman until the body collapsed before he could cast a meaningful defensive spell. Years of ritual preparation, betrayal of his own people, and a successful silver breakthrough ended because he celebrated before checking his surroundings. The absurd outcome eliminated Golden Domain's surviving ogres, the invading dogfolk force, and a hidden evil god cultist in one chaotic night. Wright had deliberately planned only the poisoned food and the final ambush, yet everyone around him assumed every additional disaster had been calculated too. His legend as a lord who saw many moves ahead grew stronger, while he privately accepted that luck remained one of Golden Domain's most reliable military resources. Once the danger passed, Wright ordered surviving poisoned dogfolk restrained, stripped of weapons, and treated with properly boiled golden potato vines. Rabbit folk and goblins moved through the battlefield like an angry cleanup crew, tying dozens of weak soldiers into neat bundles. 46 dogfolk survived the combined poisoning and ogre massacre, enough to become a labor force instead of a pile of corpses. Gordon removed the cultist's magic crystal and revealed a prize far more valuable than the bronze crystal Wright would have gained before the ritual. The shaman had completed his breakthrough long enough to leave behind a true silver rank crystal glowing with concentrated power. Wright had knowingly accepted that final risk because letting the ritual finish increased the reward by an entire major rank. Blake later asked how Wright had dared handguns to former slaves and trust them to maintain the deception while enemy soldiers occupied their homes. Wright answered that trust created miracles, and that Golden Domain survived because its people had chosen not to betray one another. The speech sounded noble, but the hidden calculation was appraisal. Every participant's loyalty score had already made betrayal statistically unlikely. Wright preferred using a reliable supernatural spreadsheet, while allowing everyone else to believe their lord simply possessed extraordinary faith in character. He carried the silver crystal directly to the golden tree, whose branches shook almost eagerly as the roots consumed the rare energy. Wright advanced again, reaching bronze mid after only weeks at a pace ordinary fighters could barely imagine. The improvement sharpened his senses and strength, but it also revealed that the golden tree's appetite increased dramatically at higher stages. Future growth would demand stronger and more numerous crystals, making battlefield victories increasingly important to both territory and lord. The silver crystal produced not one but two heroic spirit fruits, each tied to another giant transformation. One granted the Warhammer Giant, a massive siege fighter designed around overwhelming impact and a colossal weapon. The other granted the Jaw Giant, smaller than Harold's armored form but built around speed and enormous crushing bite. Wright immediately knew the intended recipients because Gordon and Blake had waited loyally, while Harold received the first great blessing. The next morning he gathered citizens around the central square while the captured dog folk lay bound in the middle like miserable furry logs. Wright praised the settlement for surviving both soldiers and monsters, then awarded every participating citizen a large point bonus. Since points represented meals, housing, and progress toward expensive training manuals, the announcement created louder celebration than ordinary money would have. A full day of work earned only a few points, so the bonus effectively removed many days from the wait for supernatural training. Second Bro and Old Tahu updated ledgers, while younger lizard people watched with increasingly obvious envy from outside the formal point system. The lizard tribe still received food for labor, but its elder had not fully joined Golden Domain and therefore retained no access to advancement manuals. Wright understood the elder's caution, but also noticed that younger lizards were beginning to resent independence when citizenship offered a path toward power. After rewarding the general population, Wright called Gordon and Blake forward for special recognition. He announced that their early warning had made the entire defense possible, and that both would advance immediately so they could protect the territory better. The two mercenaries dropped to their knees with enough excitement that joints audibly struck the wooden platform. Wright asked for eternal loyalty and defense of Golden Domain, and both men accepted without hesitation after everything they had witnessed. The familiar divine performance followed, a cut finger, golden illumination, and two fruits appearing as though created directly from Louis's blood. Gordon and Blake ate together while fighting spirit erupted around them and shattered the limits, keeping each at black iron. Both settled into bronze rank before the cheering crowd, transforming Wright's tiny guard force into 3 genuine knights. Blake received the Warhammer Giant, while Gordon inherited the Jaw Giant and the fast destructive roll that came with it. Golden Domain now possessed an armored giant, a living siege hammer, and a high-speed giant built to tear through defenses with its jaws. To residents watching from below, Wright had again converted loyalty into supernatural power in minutes rather than years. He used the moment deliberately, promising that today's knights represented what ordinary citizens could become through service and advancement. Goblins pounded their chests, rabbits stomped their feet, and even skeptical lizard men struggled to pretend the spectacle had not impressed them. The Lizard Elders' internal crisis became visible as younger members stared at training rewards their tribe's independence kept out of reach. Wright did not force the issue because impatience would only let the Elder frame citizenship as surrender rather than opportunity. Instead, he turned to the surviving dogfolk and announced that invaders who tried to steal Golden Domain's food would now work to replace what they had threatened. The captives would become laborers under Golden Domain's control rather than being executed after recovery. Nobody among the residents objected strongly, because the memory of starvation made mercy towards soldiers who had tried to take winter supplies feel complicated. Wright had gained new workers, another rank, 2 giant fruits, a silver crystal's benefits, and a stronger reputation without losing his settlement. Yet the greatest strategic development remained elsewhere, riding toward Blackstone Fortress with a butler, an armored knight, and a newly empowered rabbit assassin. If Holly's mission succeeded, Golden Domain would reconnect with markets, rescue Tahana's people, and turn Wright's alchemy into a reliable stream of money. If it failed, the settlement would lose its best administrator, strongest knight, and stealth specialist at the same time. Wright therefore had no luxury of celebrating indefinitely, because success had increased Golden Domain's dependence on systems larger than one lucky battlefield. The frontier was becoming a network of trade, training, refugees, supernatural resources, and enemies capable of noticing every sign of growth. For the first time, Wright's strange little territory looked valuable enough that larger powers might eventually care who controlled it. That was exactly what he wanted in the long term, and exactly what made every short-term mistake more dangerous. He needed walls before fame, trained citizens before wealth, and reliable allies before the Golden Tree's secret attracted someone strong enough to take it. Golden Domain had survived because outsiders repeatedly underestimated it, but giant transformations and impossible potions could not remain invisible forever. Wright's next challenge was therefore not merely defeating another enemy, it was learning how to let the outside world see profit without seeing the source. Holly's negotiating ability would determine whether Moonlight Tears became funding for development or a trail leading dangerous buyers directly back to the swamp. Tahana's new skills would determine whether the trade team could move through hostile territory without exposing who or what protected them. Harold's player inventory would determine whether a tiny group could transport enough goods to matter while appearing almost empty-handed. Each advantage came from the Golden Tree, but Wright increasingly disguised that common origin behind family legends, divine bloodline stories, and ordinary contracts. The deception was becoming an institution of its own, one that even loyal followers reinforced, because they sincerely believed the version Wright had created. Harold considered himself blessed by a divine family line. Tahana accepted the same explanation, and Gordon and Blake had witnessed enough to stop questioning it. Wright understood that correcting them would provide no practical benefit while risking the one secret every future enemy killed to uncover. His greatest defense was therefore not simply necromancy, firearms, or giant warriors. It was convincing everyone to search for the wrong explanation. That strategy had begun accidentally when his appearance made merchants mistake him for elite nobility, and now protected a treasure powerful enough to reshape kingdoms. Meanwhile, the people of Golden Domain kept seeing the same pattern from below. Follow the rules, contribute, and impossible opportunities appeared. The point system turned work into advancement, the golden potatoes turned wasteland into food, and the Lord's blessings turned mercenaries into knights. Refugees who had arrived with no home could now imagine owning houses, learning combat methods, and raising children somewhere they were not temporary guests. That psychological shift mattered more than Wright fully understood, because a territory became defensible when residents stopped thinking of escape as the safest future. Golden Domain's crude roads and wooden walls still looked unimpressive to outsiders, but loyalty was becoming harder than timber and more valuable than stone. Every attack had compressed that process, forcing people to choose whether the settlement was merely where they worked or where they belonged. Again and again, they chose belonging, and each choice made the next one easier. Wright had started with dead mercenaries because nobody living would work for him. Now living citizens were volunteering to become stronger for the territory. The difference had emerged through hundreds of small decisions rather than one grand conquest, which made the growth harder for Wright himself to notice. But the outside world was about to notice, because Holly was carrying 100 perfect healing potions toward a fortress built around war and scarcity. Once those bottles reached professional merchants, Golden Domain would stop being invisible to people who understood exactly how valuable impossible medicine could become. Wright put the captured dogfolk under 4 supervisors drawn from goblin and rabbit citizens who had proven reliable during the previous battles. Each supervisor received extra points and responsibility for roughly a dozen prisoners, with strict instructions against pointless cruelty or deliberate starvation. The prisoners would work, obey rules, and replace what their invasion had threatened instead of becoming targets for revenge entertainment. Big Bro accepted eagerly because the ogres that destroyed his village were finally gone, a victory he still credited almost entirely to Wright's planning. The new labor force immediately expanded what Golden Domain could attempt before winter closed the frontier. Potato fields spread eastward, irrigation channels lengthened, and workers finally opened a stone quarry capable of replacing temporary wooden construction. Wright had grown tired of every important building looking like a shed assembled during bad weather, so real stone represented civilization more than luxury. The 3 giant knights became the most terrifying construction crew imaginable, using supernatural transformations to do work normally requiring heavy machinery. Harold's armored giant flattened terrain, Blake's warhammer form shifted enormous boulders, and Gordon's Joe giant could bite directly through stubborn rock. Powers designed for war spent ordinary days improving farmland and quarry access, which Wright considered an efficient use of otherwise expensive exhaustion. Hundreds of miles away, Holly's delegation reached Blackstone Fortress dirty from the road but carrying wealth invisible inside player inventories. Holly insisted they visit a hotel before business because representatives of Golden Domain could not negotiate major contracts while looking like bandits. Tahana wore a false slave collar in public, since a freely armed rabbit folk woman would attract dangerous curiosity inside a heavily human fortress. Holly reassured her that the disguise would end as soon as business concluded and the imprisoned members of her tribe were purchased. After bathing and changing into proper clothing, Holly entered the Iris Flower Trading Company with the confidence of someone carrying a product she knew could sell itself. The same old appraiser who had examined Wright's golden fruit tested a sample of moonlight tears on a magical wound model. The simulated injury closed within seconds, proving the potion outperformed respected healing products already sold through major religious channels. The trading house immediately remembered Wright as the mysterious noble whose earlier fruit had later produced a substantial profit. Holly used that reputation rather than wasting time proving Golden Domain's seriousness from nothing. She demanded 3,000 nars per bottle and refused to negotiate downward, despite the merchant's instinct to protect margins. War and expanding history fragments were increasing demand for healing medicine, giving her every reason to hold the line. When the company asked for exclusive distribution, Holly raised the price instead of treating exclusivity as a favor. She offered 3,500 nars per bottle in exchange for total secrecy about Golden Domain as the supplier. The merchant accepted because exclusive control still left room for resale profit while eliminating competitors who might undercut the market later. 100 bottles therefore produced hundreds of thousands of nars from ingredients costing only a small fraction of the sale price. Combined with captured bank checks from the raiders, Holly now controlled nearly 1 million nars for the expedition. More importantly, she negotiated a recurring agreement requiring the trading company to purchase at least several hundred bottles every month. Wright's crude frontier laboratory had become the foundation of a pharmaceutical business before he even owned a proper stone house. The merchant admired Holly's discipline and privately wondered why someone that capable had not been recruited by a richer noble household. The old appraiser attempted to identify the potion's ingredients, but found the formula impossible to reconstruct from taste and magical testing alone. He assumed Wright had intentionally concealed the recipe through dilution, or some advanced family technique, giving the Swiss legend even more credibility. The truth was simpler and harder to copy. Wright was using a formula from centuries of future alchemical development. Even excellent present-day alchemists lacked the conceptual steps needed to reverse engineer the result quickly. With the trade contract secured, Holly moved straight to the slave market and used a vast portion of the new cash for Tahana's real objective. 54 rabbit folk remained available, and Holly purchased every one rather than leaving families divided for another owner's convenience. When the prisoners saw Tahana waiting outside their cells, panic broke into recognition and several began crying before anyone explained the details. Their leader had returned alive, stronger, and accompanied by people with enough money to pull them out together. Tahana finally released a breath she had carried since the betrayal that shattered her original tribe. Holly asked the market manager to feed the rescued rabbits properly, clean them, and prepare them for travel by morning. The manager agreed, and Holly thanked him for the earlier introduction that had connected her own desperate life with Wright's frontier project. After securing the rabbit folk, the delegation spent heavily on dried food, grain, winter clothing, blankets, sanitation supplies, and construction necessities. Holly followed Wright's alchemy list exactly and bought large quantities of ingredients while never discussing what formulas they supported. She also searched discreetly for black market magic crystals, converting cash into resources that had far more value inside an isolated territory. Wright had ordered her to spend aggressively because money sitting unused in Golden Domain could not become food, walls, medicine, or power. That buying spree created an obvious problem. Mercenaries watching the markets noticed one woman purchasing supplies worth a fortune with only one visible guard. Harold detected the attention quickly, but the interested men mistook his familiar face and quiet posture for proof that he remained only black iron. The Firewolf Mercenary Company learned that Holly had moved roughly 500,000 nars through local businesses and began planning to rob the departing caravan. Their leader stood at bronze upper and believed one supposedly black iron guard made the target almost insultingly easy. What the Firewolves could not understand was why the huge purchase required only a few carts when the goods should have filled a long wagon train. Harold and Tahana were carrying the expensive items inside invisible player inventories, eliminating both weight and the evidence thieves expected to see. The mercenary spies followed anyway, because greed usually prefers a weak explanation over walking away from imagined profit. Harold sensed the tale after departure and considered returning for more escorts, but Tahana asked to handle the first scouts herself. He agreed because sparring had already shown him how dangerous her new combination of fighting spirit, magic, stealth, and darkstalker skills had become. Tahana rode back alone and deliberately appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary rabbit folk traveler on horseback. 4 mercenary scouts laughed when no supernatural aura appeared and even fired a signal to call their companions before attacking. At roughly 50 meters, Tahana activated Shadow Kill and turned every enemy's darkness against its owner. Black tendrils wrapped legs and torsos, ripped riders from saddles, and slammed all 4 into the road before they understood she had cast anything. One shadow formed around a throat and snapped a neck, while another mercenary died beneath the hooves of Tahana's fighting spirit-enhanced mount. The remaining men discovered too late that a rabbit folk could now wield both martial power and magic, something their worldview said should be impossible. Tahana ended the fight within moments, judged the enemies easier than expected, and wondered privately how strong Wright must be if his gift had made her this dangerous. Wright would have preferred she keep believing the answer involved overwhelming hidden strength rather than a very useful tree and excellent timing. Tahana also collected 4 abandoned warhorses because Golden Domain had developed an amusing habit of profiting from failed robberies. Her facelessness skill added another layer of security, making survivors or observers struggle to preserve a reliable description of the attacker. The Firewolf reinforcements later found stripped corpses and almost no information, which angered their captain enough to make the next decision worse. 8 mercenaries rode out in pursuit, including 2 bronze fighters and a leader strong enough to believe Harold could not possibly resist. Tahana heard the approach first, but this time Harold decided he would handle the problem before the pursuit endangered the rescued rabbits. He waited calmly on foot while the firewolves charged, even pausing long enough to finish food as if a mounted attack were an inconvenience. The captain mocked Harold for facing several fighters alone and planned humiliations that assumed the battle had already been won. Harold instead offered them a chance to surrender and admitted he was more worried about the horses than the men riding them. When they attacked, he cut his palm, triggered the heroic spirit, and detonated a wave of white steam across the road. The armored giant rose where one human had stood, throwing riders from saddles under the shock of heat and transformed mass. Harold crushed one apprentice mage beneath a hand and kicked another fighter away with enough force to turn a body into debris. The Firewolf captain's confidence collapsed when a building-sized foot lifted over him instead of an ordinary sword. He tried to run and died beneath the stomp before Braun's upper strength could become meaningful. The vice-captain launched a desperate golden fighting spirit slash that struck the giant's chest with almost no effect. Harold caught him in one hand, ignored the last-second plea for mercy, and ended the threat before moving toward the remaining riders. Several mercenaries escaped only because the giant transformation had a strict time limit and Harold could not chase everyone indefinitely. Those survivors accidentally became free advertising, carrying stories of a terrifying giant nightback into every tavern around Blackstone Fortress. Harold collected bronze magic crystals, weapons, money, and abandoned horses before returning to the delegation. Between his battle and Tahana's ambush, the trade mission had acquired 7 additional horses from people who intended to rob them. Tahana praised Harold's transformation, while Harold treated the victory as simple enforcement against anyone foolish enough to threaten his lord's property. Back in Golden Domain, Wright faced problems far less glamorous than giant battles, but equally important to keeping a frontier community alive. A few dogfolk prisoners refused labor and attacked guards, choosing death rather than captivity after their failed invasion. Wright ordered those active threats executed while leaving compliant prisoners alive, a decision he treated as security rather than pleasure. He had become responsible for more than 100 residents, and one violent prisoner could not be allowed to sabotage food, tools, or people everyone depended on. The remaining dogfolk became much more cooperative after seeing that rebellion against armed supervisors carried immediate consequences. Their labor pushed construction faster than Wright expected, expanding houses, farms, irrigation, quarry work, and winter stores across the territory. His only frustration was that the perfect workforce for heavy labor already existed underground in the form of skeletons he did not dare reveal publicly. Necromancy remained one of the world's most hated crimes, incompatible with the divine bloodline image currently protecting his reputation. Wright therefore kept undead magic hidden even when using it openly would have saved countless hours of work. The first serious cold arrived, bringing reminders that winter meant more Beast Alliance pressure, hungrier monsters, and refugees pushed out of failing settlements. Wright accelerated housing, defenses, firewood, and food production because survival through winter would decide whether Golden Domain remained a curiosity or became permanent. With the ogres gone, he also wanted to increase the population before empty territory attracted stronger enemies or remained economically useless. Big Bro returned to the forest searching for surviving goblins and came back several days later with 37 newcomers. The group included smaller goblins and great goblins, along with enough females to make long-term population recovery possible. Wright learned more goblin biology than he ever wanted while confirming that one mother could support surprisingly rapid demographic growth. He granted the newcomers temporary status, work for several months, avoid serious trouble, and earn permanent citizenship afterward. Before he finished planning where they would live, Blake arrived with news that Holly's delegation had returned carrying an entire crowd of rabbit folk. Wright brought Ellie to meet her mother while Harold reported success and Holly summarized the trade contracts, robberies, rescues, and unexpected extra horses. Tahana's original group rushed toward the 54 rescued rabbits, and the settlement filled with embraces, crying, and frantic attempts to explain everything at once. Wright allowed the reunion without interruption, though the newly purchased rabbits kept temporary collars until the cost of their rescue had been worked through. The decision sounded harsh beside his earlier emancipation, but he wanted one consistent rule: freedom would be real, and obligations would also be real. The lizard elder chose that moment to end his own long hesitation about formal citizenship. Younger lizard men had watched goblins and rabbits gain points, training manuals, and supernatural advancement while their tribe remained outside the system. Pressure inside the swamp community finally outweighed the elder's desire to preserve independent authority. He prostrated himself before Wright and asked that the Grayscale tribe be accepted completely as citizens of Golden Domain. Wright teased him by noting that the tribe had already submitted once, forcing the elder to explain that this time obedience would be permanent rather than conditional. The old lizard even offered absolute authority over life and death, language Wright immediately rejected as unnecessary for ordinary governance. He promised no pointless suicide orders and extended the same point system and advancement rules used by other citizens. Golden Domain's legal code remained extremely small. Disputes went through group supervisors, serious unresolved cases reached Wright, and property or people could not be abused. Theft, assault, coercion, and deliberate destruction of shared resources were treated as threats to the entire frontier community. When Wright requested a real census, the elder admitted the tribe actually numbered 98 rather than the much lower figure previously reported. Wright punished the deception by removing bonus points instead of using violence, making the message clear without creating a blood feud. The new census nearly stunned him when the total population approached 300 after beginning with one lonely human only a month earlier. Golden Domain now held 6 humans, scores of lizard people, dozens of goblins, a large rabbit folk community, and dog folk prisoners under supervision. The numbers were still tiny beside any real kingdom, yet to Wright the change felt enormous because every roof and person had appeared through decisions he personally made. Soon afterward, he completed another alchemical breakthrough by successfully producing separate black iron advancement potions for magic and martial paths. Those formulas meant ordinary intelligent citizens could potentially awaken supernatural circuits instead of waiting for rare accidents or inherited privilege. Mass production could turn Golden Domain's point system into an actual factory for new supernatural fighters over time. Wright was already calculating batches when Holly entered the laboratory with urgency so unusual that he abandoned the work immediately. Creatures had emerged from the forest requesting an audience, and the knights were already facing them near the territorial edge. 9 black spider people stood there, each with a giant spider lower body and a human-like female torso, wrapped in silk. Their clustered eyes and multiple legs gave even experienced fighters reason to keep weapons close, while ordinary black spiders waited behind them. Wright recognized the species from the game, an all-female society reproducing without males and governed primarily by strength. Their survival culture could become brutally cannibalistic when food ran short, including the consumption of eggs or weaker young. Appraisal identified several bronze individuals among the delegation, making them stronger than casual diplomats but not yet an overwhelming invasion force. Their leader, Agnes, bowed politely and introduced herself as a servant of the Spider Mother ruling deeper forest territory. According to Agnes, her mistress also possessed a royal land deed and wished to welcome the new human neighbor into a friendly relationship. Wright considered friendship from a society willing to eat its own offspring highly questionable, especially when neighboring deed holders could gain enormously by killing each other. He nevertheless refused to insult the delegation outright, because closing diplomatic doors before understanding an enemy wasted opportunities. Wright declined to enter the spider territory, and instead proposed a meeting directly on the border where both lords could remain inside their own deed range. The arrangement preserved teleportation rights, and prevented either side from forcing the other into prepared terrain. Agnes accepted the neutral ground proposal and disappeared with her delegation into the trees at disturbing speed and silence. Wright and Harold exchanged the kind of look that required no words. Giant cannibal spiders inviting dinner was almost certainly not an innocent social call. Holly worried about the meeting, but Wright reminded her that territorial teleportation gave him a powerful emergency exit as long as he stayed inside Golden Domain. Harold insisted on accompanying him, while Gordon and Blake volunteered as reserve and Tahana offered to remain invisible nearby. Wright assigned Harold to walk openly beside him, Tahana to shadow the meeting, and the other giant knights to wait where they could intervene if necessary. His goal was information, not immediate war, because the species' true numbers and leadership strength remained unknown. Then Wright returned to the laboratory and spent the 3 preparation days on a secret recipe no alchemist in the current era was supposed to know. Holly's shopping trip had provided unusual metals that could be combined into supernatural explosives remembered from the game. Wright began producing magical bombs while joking privately that nobody should attend a Spider Queen's dinner without suitable party favors. Deep inside the neighboring forest, the spider territory proved exactly as pleasant as expected: dead trees, heavy webs, bones, and silk-covered structures. Agnes reported that Golden Domain's lord appeared young, possessed almost no detectable supernatural aura, and commanded only a small population. The Spider Mother interpreted those observations as confirmation that her new neighbor was weak enough to consume rather than negotiate with. She ordered poisoned food prepared for the meeting, and considered the human deed an opportunity rather than a political complication. Agnes obeyed, but carried private doubts shaped by an earlier encounter with a human bard who had told her stories of wars, crowds, and worlds beyond the forest. The bard had died, leaving behind notes that made Agnes imagine a life larger than endless webs and predation. Several days later, Wright and Harold entered the forest while Tahana followed unseen behind them using Darkstalker concealment. After hours of travel, they reached a clearing where a crude feast waited on a table positioned exactly across the border between the 2 territories. Colorful fruit and raw animal flesh lay in pools of blood, making the spider mother's concept of hospitality look more like preparation for an execution. The border placement was politically smart, because both land deed holders retained access to their own territorial powers and emergency movement. The spider mother herself was enormous, scared, and physically larger than ordinary black spider people by a frightening margin. Behind her stood roughly 20 supernatural spider warriors ready to release webs the moment negotiation failed. Appraisal confirmed the most important fact. The spider mother stood at silver lower, the strongest local enemy Wright had directly faced since claiming Golden Domain. Her aura alone carried enough pressure to remind everyone that Wright's bronze mid-rank was nowhere near equal in straightforward personal strength. The spider mother saw youth smaller size and weak visible aura, then struggled to conceal excitement at what looked like edible political prey. Wright introduced himself formally and asked what she wanted, refusing to react to the deliberate pressure of her presence. She pushed a cup of local fruit juice toward him and invited him to begin with hospitality before discussing borders. Wright appraised the drink and found poison frog saliva strong enough to kill, then checked the fruit and meat and found those poisoned as well. The entire table had been saturated with toxins so aggressively that Wright almost respected the spider mother's complete lack of subtlety. In human courts, poisoners usually hid tiny doses inside carefully selected dishes, but this plan resembled drowning the entire meal in venom. Wright simply announced that he would not eat because the food was poisoned, instantly destroying the spider mother's imagined surprise. Killing intent flooded the clearing as spider warriors raised their hands, and webbing tightened between their fingers. The spider mother stopped them long enough to demand how a human had detected the poison that had killed stronger enemies before. Wright offered an exchange of questions and first asked whether she was the strongest individual within spider territory. She mocked human politics and confirmed that black spider people allowed only strength to rule, effectively identifying herself as the final authority. Once Wright knew no hidden stronger spider waited behind her, he refused to answer how he detected the poison. The insult pushed her anger exactly where he wanted it, because rage makes proud rulers accept challenges they might otherwise calculate more carefully. Wright raised a hand and summoned the royal land deed into his palm, filling the clearing with golden light. He invoked the ancient right of Lord's War and formally challenged the spider mother, as one deed holder confronting another. The system was brutally simple. 2 territorial rulers could place land, people, authority, and life into a binding contest where the winner claimed everything. The spider mother laughed rather than hesitated, convinced the young human had just volunteered to die in a way that made conquest legally effortless. Her own land deed emerged covered in web-like markings, and the 2 golden documents pulled toward one another under ancient authority. Wright stood bronze mid against a silver lower ruler physically several times his mass, making the challenge look irrational by every visible measure. That appearance was part of the trap, because the spider mother was evaluating his body, while Wright was evaluating an entire battlefield. He proposed traditional full territory warfare with a preparation window before both sides committed their forces. Victory would come through surrender or complete defeat, and the losing side's power, land, and subjects would fall under the winner's authority. The spider mother accepted eagerly, seeing a short massacre rather than the beginning of a campaign designed around information she did not possess. The land deeds merged into one glowing contract, recorded the terms in ancient runes, and demanded blood signatures that removed the option of changing minds later. Once the agreement locked, Wright and Harold left the clearing without discussing strategy inside a forest where spider scouts could be listening from every web. Harold waited until they were safely outside before asking whether his lord truly had a plan for fighting an enemy 2 full tiers higher. Wright refused to explain until they reached open territory, where observation became much harder for the black spider people. His confidence came from preparation rather than rank, especially the explosives finished during the days before the meeting. The war would not be a duel between a bronze lord and a silver spider. It would be a contest between 2 systems of warfare. Spider society relied on numbers, webs, natural bodies, poison, and straightforward supernatural hierarchy. Golden Domain relied on guns, game knowledge, hidden classes, giant transformations, alchemy, land deed mobility, and citizens trained through unusual incentives. Wright needed the spider mother to keep thinking she was fighting a weak young noble with a handful of mediocre guards. Every secret revealed too early would make her more cautious and allow the forest terrain to favor spiders instead of defenders. That meant the first battle objective was psychological rather than lethal, force the enemy into mistakes before using Golden Domain's heaviest weapons. Wright also understood that the forest itself was a threat, because dense webs and narrow trees limited giant movement while amplifying spider ambushes. Fighting there would waste Harold. Blake, and Gordon's greatest advantages and allow enemies to attack from every direction. Open ground near Golden Domain reversed those conditions, giving firearms clear lines, catapults room to fire, and giant form space to swing. The challenge therefore became simple to describe but difficult to execute: make a stronger ruler abandon her ideal battlefield voluntarily. Wright intended to accomplish that by attacking Pride rather than trying to overpower silver rank intelligence with direct force. The Spider Mother had already shown impatience, contempt for weaklings, and confidence that raw numbers solved every problem. If those emotions could be intensified, she would drive her army exactly where Wright needed it. Golden Domain's strange history had trained him for this style of war, because half his victories came from letting enemies misunderstand what they were seeing. This time, however, the misunderstanding would not be accidental. Wright was preparing one deliberately from the first skeleton onward. As the preparation window began counting down, every citizen received orders while the neighboring forest filled with spider troops expecting an easy feast. The Lord's War had started before either army moved, and Wright's first weapon was the certainty his enemy had already chosen to underestimate him. 3 hours after leaving the forest meeting, Wright reached open ground and immediately turned private strategy into shouted construction orders. His first question went to Holly and concerned the catapults she had been building from old game-era designs. Holly reported only 11 machines were complete, and none had wheels sturdy enough for rapid repositioning across the settlement. Wright accepted the limitation because mobility was not the role he needed those wooden frames to perform. The catapults only had to throw one specific kind of projectile into a dense enemy formation approaching across known ground. 11 stationary launchers therefore became enough to anchor the center of a battlefield instead of an incomplete engineering project. Wright ordered a full assembly, and Holly's expression changed when she realized the diplomatic meeting had ended in formal war. Workers left ordinary tasks, supervisors gathered species groups, and Golden Domain shifted from construction site to defensive position within minutes. Everyone knew the forest held black spider people, but almost nobody understood how many were now preparing to cross the border. Wright kept the worst numbers from spreading casually until positions were assigned, because panic before organization would waste the preparation window. In spider territory, the Spider Mother questioned Agnes about every detail observed during earlier reconnaissance. Agnes confirmed that she had seen no silver-rank defender and believed Harold to be the strongest obvious combatant during her original scouting period. That report was already outdated because Gordon and Blake had received giant fruits after much of her surveillance. Agnes also could not detect Wright's bronze mid-power through the golden tree's concealment, reinforcing the fiction that the Lord himself was ordinary. The Spider Mother learned Golden Domain contained fewer than 300 inhabitants and only a handful of humans. Rather than becoming suspicious of a multi-species territory, she joked that Wright might simply have unusual tastes in non-human companions. Her own experiences with strange human visitors made that explanation feel believable enough to dismiss deeper questions. She focused on the visible cards she thought she understood: one bronze knight, weak workers, a young lord, and primitive wooden defenses. To the Spider Mother, individual tricks stopped mattering once numbers became overwhelming, because sheer bodies could crush any small formation eventually. She mobilized roughly 1,800 black spiders across the territory, with around 1,200 considered immediately combat-ready. Among them were dozens of supernatural fighters, including 30 black iron, 11 bronze, and the silver-rank Spider Mother herself. On paper, Golden Domain faced roughly 4 enemies for every defender before supernatural rank differences were even considered. That calculation encouraged the Spider Mother to prepare for extermination instead of a cautious campaign. Agnes suggested waiting, observing defenses, and using the forest's webs as an advantage, advice based on actual scouting rather than pride. The Spider Mother treated caution as insubordination and ordered Agnes to stop thinking beyond the instructions she had been given. That reaction told Agnes exactly how little room remained for strategy once her ruler's confidence had become personal. A scout then reported skeleton soldiers scattered through the forest approach, at least several dozen weak undead wandering between trees. The Spider Mother laughed, because necromancy finally appeared to explain Wright's mysterious confidence in a form she considered pathetic. Skeletons looked fragile beside supernatural spiders, with no muscles, no armor, and little ability to survive a direct strike. She ordered the undead destroyed and assumed she had just uncovered the human lord's secret weapon before the real battle even started. What she did not know was that Wright had spent the preparation window, moving through the forest under land-eat awareness and hidden routes. He summoned every skeleton he could manage and attached compact packages containing his newest alchemical discovery. The explosive mixture used metals and reactions not yet recognized by contemporary alchemists as a battlefield technology. Wright had translated game knowledge into physical bombs, turning a forbidden magical workforce into disposable delivery systems. Each prepared skeleton carried enough explosive force to punish any enemy careless enough to break it at close range. Undead made ideal carriers because they felt no fear, required no return path, and could keep walking after any living soldier would hesitate. Wright did not need them to win duels. He needed them to be underestimated long enough for one touch to become catastrophic. Tahana moved through the same forest under concealment, eliminating spider scouts that approached sensitive positions. Every fresh corpse gave Wright another possible skeleton, allowing enemy reconnaissance losses to become additional pieces on his board. Tahana watched him raise the dead and discovered a secret far more dangerous socially than any fruit blessing. Necromancy was not merely unusual magic. Exposure could turn churches, nobles, and ordinary citizens against the lord she had sworn to follow. Her first instinct compared the revelation to discovering that a trusted employer secretly practiced something society associated with monsters and criminals. Then loyalty and evidence forced a more complicated conclusion, because Wright had never used undead to torture innocents or desecrate living followers. The skeletons obeyed orders, protected people, carried bombs, and appeared to contain none of the soul's religious doctrine claimed might be suffering. Tahana therefore performed impressive mental gymnastics and decided that evil necromancers were evil, while her lord's necromancy was somehow a separate category. Wright did not have time to debate theology because movement in the forest announced the first large enemy wave. Roughly 300 black spiders advanced as the vanguard, flowing between trees like a dark tide over roots and old leaves. Their purpose was to sweep aside scattered defenses, identify serious resistance, and open the path for the much larger main force behind them. The first spider warrior encountered one skeleton and destroyed it casually with a single blow. Nothing dramatic followed immediately, so nearby spiders laughed at the weak bones their enemy had apparently trusted for defense. Another warrior approached a second skeleton with the same confidence, reaching out as if clearing trash from the path. That skeleton detonated on contact and erased the humor from the formation in one violent flash. Heat and force tore through every spider close enough to the blast, leaving green blood and broken limbs scattered across the forest floor. The surviving vanguard froze because they had no framework for understanding why one identical skeleton exploded while another had simply collapsed. Wright's concept was brutal but efficient: hide explosives inside expendable undead, and let the enemy's own aggression trigger the weapon. The forest made the effect worse because webs, dry material, and close formation created opportunities for fire and panic to spread beyond the first blast. Several dozen skeletons occupied different approach routes, forcing spiders to treat every set of bones as a possible mine. Yet Wright had another layer of deception inside the trap, because he could not afford enough explosives to arm every undead carrier. Some skeletons contained bombs and some contained nothing beyond bones, making visual identification impossible, even after the first detonation. A brave spider smashed another skeleton and received no explosion, briefly convincing nearby fighters that the earlier blast might have been an isolated trick. They crowded around the next target with renewed confidence, only for that one to detonate and tear half the group apart. From that moment, the vanguard stopped fighting skeletons logically and began treating uncertainty itself as the threat. A harmless undead could consume minutes because nobody wanted to be the warrior who discovered the hidden bomb by touching it. Spider formations detoured around broken bones, slowed at empty paths, and argued over which targets were safe enough to destroy. Wright had converted limited explosives into psychological warfare, multiplying the value of every real bomb through several fake possibilities. Fear also created exactly the gaps Tahana and Wright needed for their second layer of attack. Using Darkstalker concealment, the pair moved through distracted formations while spider attention remained fixed on the walking bones. Tahana strangled targets through shadows, struck from blind angles, and disappeared before ordinary soldiers could identify where the attack originated. Wright used the same unlocked profession abilities where useful, combining them with firearms and knowledge of the forest routes inside his deed range. Their priority was not ordinary spiders but supernatural fighters capable of organizing resistance or surviving later defensive volleys. One isolated black iron spider vanished from the line, then another fell without a visible attacker standing near the body. Bronze-level fighters searching for hidden enemies discovered that every pause made them vulnerable to shadows and every pursuit risked another skeleton bomb. The vanguard's numerical advantage became increasingly meaningless because it could not concentrate safely on any single threat. Wright and Tahana repeated the cycle with ruthless simplicity: approach unseen, strike a supernatural target, Leave before the response formed. The spiders began imagining assassins behind every trunk and explosives inside every bone pile. Panic spread faster than casualties because the enemy no longer understood which objects were dangerous and which were only distractions. After roughly an hour, every supernatural fighter assigned to the vanguard had been eliminated. The remaining ordinary spiders lost the structure holding the advance together and retreated through the forest in disorder. 300 attackers returned to the main formation carrying stories about exploding skeletons, invisible killers, and enemies they could not read. The spider mother's reaction was not caution but humiliation, because she heard fear where she expected simple obedience. She struck the ground hard enough to leave craters and accused the vanguard of cowardice for failing to escape the forest itself. Soldiers tried explaining that some skeletons exploded while others did not, but uncertainty sounded like an excuse to a ruler already enraged. The spider mother ordered the next assault to abandon careful formations completely and crush Golden Domain through overwhelming numbers. Retreating fighters were pushed to the front and threatened with death if they hesitated again. That decision was exactly the result Wright had wanted from the first hidden bomb. Tahana asked whether destroying only the vanguard mattered when the main spider army remained almost untouched behind it. Wright explained that the vanguard had never been the real target. The spider mother's judgment was. Inside the forest, black spider people possessed webs, familiarity, concealment points, vertical movement, and countless natural ambush positions. Golden Domain's giants could barely maneuver between dense trees without losing speed and exposing their enormous bodies to attacks from every angle. Catapults could not fire effectively through the canopy, and firearm lines would struggle to maintain clear fields of view. A disciplined spider mother could have remained inside that terrain and forced Wright to choose between attacking at a disadvantage or waiting under pressure. An angry spider mother, however, would charge across open ground simply to prove that weak humans could not frighten her children. Wright had used limited vanguard casualties to purchase something more valuable than bodies, the enemy commander's emotional predictability. Tahana finally understood that the skeleton bombs had been designed as bait as much as weapons. The retreat itself carried the bait back to the spider mother, where shame and rage completed the trap without Wright needing to deliver another message. In the spider camp, the ruler physically demonstrated that most skeletons were harmless by grabbing one that did not explode. She mocked her frightened soldiers for running from sticks and bones, ignoring the fact that nobody could know which skeleton carried the next real charge. The cowards were placed at the front and ordered forward under threat of being eaten by their own side. Behind them, a much larger mass gathered until the forest floor seemed to move under hundreds upon hundreds of black legs. The spider mother ordered everyone to advance, choosing raw pressure over the observation Agnes had originally recommended. Dawn began breaking over Golden Domain as the spider army approached the final stretch of trees. Gold light entered the open fields and revealed the defensive line Wright had spent the preparation window assembling. Wooden barricades marked the front, crude compared with fortress walls but enough to organize shooters and slow anything surviving the approach. 20 goblins and rabbits crouched behind those barriers carrying steam handguns and ammunition arranged for repeated alternating volleys. Behind the firing line stood 11 completed catapults, each fixed in place and already loaded for the enemy route Wright expected. Their projectiles were black spheres packed with far larger explosive charges than the compact bombs carried by skeletons. Further back waited workers, reserves, ammunition carriers, and people whose jobs mattered even if they never swung a weapon directly. Harold, Blake, and Gordon held positions where they could respond once spiders crossed the zones intended for ranged fire. Tahana returned from the forest with Wright, exhausted from assassination work but still prepared to disappear again if another precise strike became necessary. Holly coordinated supplies and movement behind the line, converting Wright's battle ideas into actual people standing in the correct places. Wright himself stood openly in front of the barricades, purple hair catching the morning light instead of hiding behind soldiers. The position looked reckless, but visibility mattered because terrified residents needed one fixed point more than another body behind cover. The ground began to vibrate before most defenders could see the enemy, announcing the scale of the charge through their feet. Then black bodies erupted from the tree line in numbers large enough to make every earlier battle seem small. Hundreds became 1,000, and the open ground filled with a living wave of legs, human-like torsos, webs, and predatory movement. Hands tightened around gun grips while rabbit ears flattened and goblin shoulders tensed against the instinct to run. Some defenders had survived raiders, dogfolk, ogres, and a cultist, yet nothing had prepared them for an entire neighboring population charging at once. Wright understood that the first collapse would happen inside his own line if fear spread before the spiders entered weapon range. He kept his voice steady and told everyone that he was standing directly in front of them. If fear became overwhelming, they only needed to look at his back and remember that their lord had nowhere safer to run either. The message worked because Wright had already built credibility through previous battles where he chose the exposed position rather than the rear. Trembling hands steadied enough to hold weapons, and attention shifted from the approaching wave to the purple-haired figure waiting between it and them. The spiders crossed open ground quickly, confident that numbers would absorb whatever resistance a tiny frontier settlement could produce. Wright watched distance rather than faces, counting the range where inaccurate steam weapons could finally create a useful wall of fire. Nobody fired early, because wasted ammunition would confirm the spider mother's belief that humans could be drained simply by charging long enough. The leading spiders continued advancing without understanding why defenders remained silent behind low wooden barricades. At roughly 100 meters, Wright dropped his hand and gave the order the gun line had been waiting to hear. 20 steam handguns fired in rotating volleys, and the front rank of the black wave disintegrated under concentrated projectiles. One black iron spider-woman died from a headshot before supernatural strength could matter, showing how little rank protected exposed flesh from modern force. Spiders behind her hesitated because they had never seen this kind of ranged weapon used by frontier laborers. There were no arrows to track, no obvious spells to dodge, and no visible energy blade connecting shooter to victim. Bodies simply jerked, broke, or fell as cracking reports rolled across the field from behind the barricades. Alternating shooters reduced the weakness of single-shot weapons by allowing one group to reload while another maintained pressure. Goblins who once could not hit charging cavalry now benefited from a target so dense that perfect accuracy mattered far less. Rabbit folk followed practiced timing, raising guns only when their line was ready rather than firing from panic. The charge slowed as dead spiders became physical obstacles beneath the legs of those still pushing forward. Agnes remained deeper in the formation and recognized the technology faster than most of her species. She understood that steam firearms were powerful but dependent on ammunition, meaning the defenders could not maintain the same rate forever. The spider mother reached the same conclusion through simpler instinct and drove the army forward with silver rank pressure. She ordered them to keep charging, because bullets were finite and bodies were plentiful. Fear of enemy fire collided with greater fear of their own ruler, and the spider ranks surged again over the dead. Each volley tore holes through the front, yet fresh bodies filled those holes before the shooters could finish reloading. Golden Domain's gun line was winning every exchange and still losing distance as sheer numbers absorbed the punishment. The defenders could now see individual clustered eyes and strands of webbing rather than one distant black mass. Wright waited because the next weapon depended on density, and the spider mother was compressing her own army perfectly for him. Spiders climbed over corpses, pushed past wounded allies, and concentrated toward the barricades instead of spreading across the field. That made them harder to stop with bullets but far easier to punish with area attacks. The front ranks closed to a distance where defenders began hearing screams and the clatter of spider legs over hard ground. Some workers behind the line started glancing toward escape routes despite Wright's earlier reassurance. Holly kept supply crews moving, refusing to let the emotional scale of the charge disrupt ammunition and catapult preparation. The catapult teams waited beside black explosive spheres, hands ready on ropes and frames while incoming spiders crossed the final markers. Wright continued firing measured pistol shots where useful, conserving his superior personal weapons for targets that justified the ammunition. Harold watched the front with fighting spirit rising, waiting for permission rather than transforming too early and wasting the limited giant duration. Blake and Gordon did the same, because their greatest power could vanish after only minutes and timing determined whether those minutes mattered. The Spider Mother interpreted the lack of giant transformations as evidence that the human defense had revealed everything it possessed. From her perspective, the guns were dangerous but temporary, and the weak barricades would collapse as soon as the ammunition ran dry. That belief kept her committing more soldiers into the same central lane, instead of searching for a slower flanking approach. Wright watched the enemy commander make exactly the mistake his earlier deception had been designed to create. The main spider mass reached the area immediately before the barricades, close enough that another delay would turn ranged warfare into hand-to-hand chaos. Wright finally raised his voice over the gunfire and called for the catapults. Rabbit crews loaded the larger black spheres into throwing arms already angled toward the densest sections of the charge. The explosives used the same hidden alchemical principle as the skeleton bombs, but in quantities large enough to erase groups rather than squads. Teams pulled the mechanisms back, checked alignment by landmarks, and waited for Wright's release signal. 11 machines launched almost together, sending black spheres high above the defenders in arcs the black spider people had never learned to read. For a moment the projectiles looked almost harmless against the scale of the army beneath them. Then the first sphere struck inside the formation and turned clustered bodies into a blast of heat, force, and green blood. Additional explosions followed across the field before survivors could understand that the sky itself had become dangerous. Each impact cleared a circular space through the mass like a giant eraser dragged across moving ink. More than 100 spiders disappeared in one volley, and the charge finally lost momentum for reasons numbers alone could not immediately replace. Defenders, who had been trembling moments earlier, shouted as the black wave visibly broke apart under weapons they had helped build and load. Wright ordered the catapult teams to reload instead of celebrating, because the battle remained far from decided. Spider casualties were enormous by frontier standards but still small beside an army that had begun with well over 1,000 combatants. Some attackers survived the blast zone entirely and used the confusion to continue toward the barricades. The first breakthrough spiders reached distances where single-shot guns no longer provided enough time for repeated reloads. Wright shifted the next layer into motion and allowed the professional fighters to take the front. Harold drew his sword and moved forward instead of transforming immediately, using ordinary bronze strength against enemies that leaked through in small groups. Gordon and Blake joined him, creating a three-night line directly in front of the settlement's civilian shooters. Each man had spent weeks using giant powers for construction, but their basic martial rank alone already surpassed most invading spiders. Swords cut through ordinary attackers before those bodies could climb the barricades or reach the reload crews. Every step the knights took away from the wall created more room for defenders behind them to keep firing safely. The spider mother watched from nearer the forest edge and finally smiled, believing the humans had been forced to reveal their last serious fighters. 3 bronze knights looked manageable compared with the supernatural daughters she had deliberately held back from the first waves. She ordered her own bronze spider-woman forward to kill them and break the defense in front of everyone watching. 11 elite spiders launched from the formation with enough speed to avoid obvious catapult impact zones and ordinary firearm lanes. Their movement differed completely from the mass charge, using leaps, webs and supernatural agility to close on chosen targets rather than following the crowd. Agnes remained slightly behind them, allowing others to test the human response before committing herself to the same risk. Wright noticed that caution and mentally separated Agnes from the Spider Mother's more reckless followers. The 11 bronze attackers focused on Harold, Gordon, and Blake, expecting numerical superiority to overwhelm 3 human knights quickly. Wright waited until the collision became unavoidable, then gave Blake the signal he had been waiting weeks to receive in real combat. Blake stepped forward with visible excitement rather than fear, because every construction shift had become practice for the transformation he was about to unleash. White steam burst from his body and rolled across the battlefield thick enough to hide the human figure inside. The shape beneath that steam expanded upward, widening through shoulders and limbs as supernatural mass replaced ordinary flesh. A pale giant emerged at roughly 7 meters tall, towering above spiders that had charged expecting another bronze swordsman. The transformation carried an enormous warhammer, a weapon so disproportionate that ordinary shields looked meaningless beside its head. One bronze spider-woman reached Blake first and discovered that supernatural rank could not compensate for standing inside the path of that weapon. The hammer descended with enough force to flatten her before the rest of the elite group could adjust their charge. The remains were so thoroughly crushed that identification became almost irrelevant to everyone who witnessed the impact. Blake roared through the giant form, not from panic but from the joy of finally using a power designed for destruction rather than moving construction stone. The remaining bronze spider-women skidded or changed direction as the battlefield suddenly contained a living siege weapon they had never been warned about. Golden Domain's hidden second phase had begun, and the spiders were only now discovering that the 3 bronze knights were not ordinary knights at all. Blake's warhammer giant did not pause after the first bronze spider-woman disappeared beneath the hammer, because the transformation had finally found the purpose it was built for. For weeks, the giant had been used to flatten soil, move stone, and accelerate construction across Golden Domain. Every labor shift had secretly taught Blake how the enormous body balanced, turned, planted its feet, and redirected the weight of its weapon. The spiders had expected an inexperienced transformation, but construction had already given Blake countless repetitions with the same massive limbs. What looked like peaceful development from the outside had therefore become combat practice without anyone in spider territory realizing it. The surviving bronze spider-woman stopped their charge because one of their strongest companions had vanished in a single downward strike. A moment earlier, numerical superiority had looked overwhelming, with elite spiders rushing only 3 human knights. Now one of those knights towered 7 meters above them and carried a hammer larger than anything their scouting reports had mentioned. Green blood clung to the enormous weapon, making the cost of approaching Blake impossible to misunderstand. The giant's pale body stood out against the dark wave of spiders like a siege tower that had suddenly learned how to move. Even ordinary spiders farther behind slowed when they saw bronze warriors hesitate, instead of continuing the attack. That hesitation spread faster than any spoken warning because battlefield confidence often collapses when the strongest fighters reveal fear first. Blake felt none of that fear, and the roar coming through the giant form carried more excitement than anger. He had spent too many days using a legendary transformation for construction work to waste the first real chance to swing freely. The Warhammer giant rotated its shoulders and shifted its stance with the comfort of a worker finally using the correct tool for its intended job. Wright watched from the defense line and saw preparation paying off in a form Agnes and the Spider Mother had never calculated. The enemy had known Golden Domain possessed bronze knights, but rank alone had hidden the scale of the powers attached to those knights. That missing information was now turning a planned elite strike into another source of panic inside the spider formation. Blake swung the warhammer to his left, using the giant body's full reach rather than chasing individual targets. The hammer crossed the field like a moving wall, leaving ordinary spiders with almost no space to evade once the arc began. Roughly 20 spiders were crushed into the grass before the weapon reached the end of that single swing. The attack did not resemble sword fighting, where technique could create narrow openings and skilled opponents could trade blows. It resembled demolition, with entire sections of the enemy line disappearing whenever the hammer occupied the same space. Blake reversed his momentum and sent the weapon back across the opposite side before the nearby spiders recovered from the first impact. Another group of roughly 30 was smashed so violently that the battlefield looked less like a duel and more like wreckage after a collapsed wall. The spiders had entered open ground to use overwhelming numbers, yet open ground also gave Blake enough room to use the warhammer's complete radius. The same forest that would have restricted Harold's giant form would also have limited Blake, but Wright had already forced the enemy away from that advantage. Every part of the battle now connected back to the earlier provocation that had driven the Spider Mother into charging outside her own web-covered terrain. Skeleton bombs had created fear, Tahana's assassinations had removed supernatural vanguard fighters, and the retreat had transformed fear into rage. That rage had brought the main army exactly where catapults, firearms, and giant bodies could operate without trees blocking them. The Spider Mother had believed anger was pushing her army toward revenge, when it was actually pushing them deeper into Wright's preferred battlefield. Blake's enormous hammer made that strategic difference visible with every patch of grass suddenly cleared of spiders. Several attackers tried to close from angles where the weapon seemed temporarily absent, hoping the giant's size would make him slow. They discovered that weeks of construction had taught Blake how to shift his footing before an enemy could exploit the end of a swing. Bronze Spider-Women still possessed speed, claws, webs, and poison, but none of those tools changed the brutal difference in physical scale. Claws struck the giant's body and failed to produce the kind of wounds that would stop an ordinary human knight. The attacks that could tear flesh from a man seemed insignificant against a form designed to survive the force of its own massive weapon. Some spiders changed tactics and used poison rather than trying to overpower the pale giant directly. Venom splashed across Blake's transformed skin, then slid away without producing the collapse his attackers expected. The sight was devastating because poison had always been one of Spider Territory's most reliable answers to physically stronger enemies. The Spider Mother herself had built confidence around toxins capable of killing opponents who might defeat her in a clean contest. Yet the Warhammer giant stood inside that battlefield without showing the vulnerability the spider species expected every living body to possess. Desperate cries rose among attackers caught near Blake, but panic could not reduce the hammer's reach or the size of the feet moving toward them. The difference became almost absurd, like small creatures trying to stop a boot by attacking the leather around it. Wright had known giant fruits were powerful from the game, but seeing one reshape a real battlefield made the old statistics feel inadequate. A screen could describe damage, armor, and range, while reality added shock, sound collapsing morale, and the terror of seeing companions erased nearby. Every impact sent another message through the spider army that Golden Domain had concealed weapons far beyond ordinary bronze strength. The firearms had already surprised them, the catapult bombs had slaughtered groups, and now a human knight had become a 7-meter siege monster. That sequence mattered because each new revelation arrived only after the spiders adapted to the previous one. Wright had not revealed everything at the opening volley, allowing the enemy to keep believing the next push would finally break his defenses. The vanguard had believed the skeletons were the secret, then the main army had believed ammunition limits would solve the gun problem. When bullets failed to stop the charge permanently, explosive catapult shells created another wall of destruction. When some spiders survived that wall and reached the barricades, the 3 bronze knights appeared as the apparent final defense. The spider mother had smiled at that moment, because she thought she had finally reached the bottom of Wright's preparation. Blake's transformation proved that the bottom was still much deeper, and the enemy had no reliable map of what remained below it. Agnes understood that uncertainty better than most, because she had deliberately remained behind when the other bronze Spider-Woman rushed forward. Her caution had seemed unnecessary while 11 elite fighters moved against 3 human knights. Now that decision was the only reason she was watching the Warhammer giant instead of lying beneath its weapon. Every one of Agnes's clustered eyes focused on the impossible human transformation unfolding in front of the forest line. Her earlier report had identified ordinary-looking people, a young lord, and a settlement whose visible strength appeared limited. Nothing in that scouting information had prepared spider territory for humans who could become giants through powers Wright had never displayed publicly. The Spider Mother had based the Lord's war on incomplete information, and Agnes was witnessing the price of that mistake in real time. Even more disturbing was the fact that Blake did not appear surprised by his own strength or confused by the transformation. He moved like someone who had practiced repeatedly, suggesting Golden Domain had prepared these abilities long before the border dinner. That meant the giant was not a desperate miracle created during the war, but an established weapon Wright had deliberately kept hidden. Agnes could only watch as another broad hammer movement forced nearby spiders to scatter rather than maintain the aggressive formation ordered by their mother. Fear of the skeleton bombs had once broken formation in the forest, and fear of the giant was beginning to recreate the same weakness in open ground. The Spider Mother's strategy depended on bodies pressing forward faster than Golden Domain could reload or reset its defenses. Blake disrupted that pressure by creating a moving zone where ordinary spiders could not safely remain for more than moments. Every detour around the Warhammer giant reduced the density of the charge and gave defenders behind the barricades more manageable targets. The giant therefore protected the settlement even when the hammer was not directly killing anything, simply by controlling where enemies dared move. Wright saw another reason his construction practice had mattered, because Blake understood how far the weapon extended before committing to each swing. A careless giant could have endangered allies standing near the front, but Golden Domain's knights had trained around workers for weeks. That experience taught them to think about space, momentum, and friendly positions instead of treating transformation as uncontrolled rage. The Warhammer power looked primitive from a distance, yet using it safely required more discipline than the spiders initially assumed. Blake's joy did not erase that discipline. It simply made every successful swing look like the best reward he had received since joining the territory. The former mercenary had once worried about wages, survival, and whether another dangerous contract would finally end his career. Now loyalty to Wright had given him a home, a future path of advancement, and a body capable of dominating elite enemies on open ground. The contrast explained why his roar sounded almost celebratory, while the spiders around him screamed for entirely different reasons. Gordon watched from nearby and recognized the same opportunity waiting inside his own heroic spirit fruit. Until this moment, the giant powers had been valuable tools for labor and training, impressive but still controlled by the needs of construction. Blake was proving that the abilities Wright distributed had an entirely different scale when used for the violence they were designed to deliver. Gordon's attention followed the retreating bronze Spider-Woman as they reconsidered attacking the Warhammer giant directly. Their confidence had been built on rank, speed, venom, and numbers, but Blake had just invalidated each advantage one after another. Rank did not help the first elite fighter survive the hammer. Speed could not protect ordinary spiders across its entire arc, and venom failed against the transformed skin. Numerical superiority only created more bodies inside a weapon path wide enough to punish groups instead of individuals. The retreat therefore came from calculation as much as fear, because continuing the same charge offered no sign of a different result. Agnes saw those elite fighters pulling away and understood that the humans had changed the rules of engagement without warning. Her mind searched for an explanation familiar to this world's bloodlines, magical species, and inherited supernatural traits. The most obvious answer was that these men somehow carried giant ancestry hidden beneath normal human bodies. That possibility was bizarre enough to shock her, because humans were not supposed to transform into creatures of this scale. Wright knew the real explanation was even stranger, involving a legendary golden tree reward from a game world that had become reality. To Agnes, however, there was no concept of game fruits, player systems, or a transmigrator distributing classes to loyal followers. She could only measure what stood in front of her, a 7-meter human giant crushing the Spider Mother's bronze fighters. The more impossible the evidence became, the more dangerous Wright himself appeared despite still standing in an ordinary human body. If one young lord could create or command this kind of transformation, then his personal rank no longer described the true strength of his territory. That was the mistake every enemy kept making when detection showed Wright as weaker than the systems around him actually allowed him to become. His greatest weapon was not one statistic, but the ability to turn knowledge, people, land, and hidden mechanics into advantages nobody could scan properly. Blake's Warhammer Giant was simply the largest physical example of that hidden strength so far. And while the Spiders were still trying to understand Blake, Gordon had already decided the battlefield was finally interesting enough for his own power. Agnes remained near the tree line, unwilling to join companions who had already learned how badly their assumptions about Golden Domain could fail. All 8 of her eyes stayed fixed on Blake, because every second supplied another fact her original scouting mission had missed. Human fighters could apparently transform into giants, their giant skin resisted familiar attacks, and Wright had concealed that information until the exact moment it mattered. Nothing about the young lord's polite border meeting had suggested he possessed followers capable of becoming living siege weapons. The poisoned feast now looked almost childish in hindsight, because Spider Territory had tried to kill a strategist it barely understood with the most obvious trick available. Wright had detected the venom instantly, confirmed the Spider Mother's rank, then challenged her only after learning she was the strongest force on her side. Agnes could now reinterpret that conversation as reconnaissance performed in plain sight, rather than reckless confidence from an inexperienced noble. The Lord's War itself also looked different now because Wright had not gambled blindly against a silver opponent. He had entered the challenge with explosives unknown to the era, necromancy hidden from outsiders, firearm formations, catapults, stealth killers, and giant knights. Each advantage had been revealed only when the previous layer stopped being enough, making the defense feel deeper every time the Spiders advanced. From Agnes' position, the terrifying part was no longer Blake alone, but the possibility that Wright still had additional surprises waiting. The Warhammer Giant continued to dominate attention, because size forced every nearby fighter to measure distance around him differently. A human sword could threaten one opponent at a time, while Blake's weapon turned entire sections of grass into places nobody wanted to occupy. The remaining bronze Spider-Women had already stopped rushing directly at the 3 knights, and were backing away from the giant's effective range. Their movement showed none of the earlier certainty that superior numbers would solve the human defenders within moments. They had seen one elite companion flattened and dozens of ordinary spiders erased by only a few swings. Claws had failed, poison had failed, and staying close enough to test another method meant standing within reach of the same hammer. Even retreat carried humiliation, because these were the Spider Mother's chosen supernatural daughters, fighters raised in a society where strength determined status. Running from a human transformation challenge, not only their battle plan, but the hierarchy that had taught them spiders were naturally superior here. Wright needed no speech to exploit that humiliation, because Blake's silhouette delivered the message more efficiently than words ever could. The giant's presence also gave Harold and Gordon space, preventing every bronze Spider-Woman from concentrating on the human knights simultaneously. The enemy formation had been designed to overwhelm 3 targets, but one target had suddenly become too large and dangerous to surround casually. Wright's earlier decision to place 3 fruit-bearing knights near the front now looked less like a last defense and more like a trap within a trap. The Spider Mother had sent her bronze children forward believing she was removing the final obstacle before the barricades. Instead, she had delivered them directly into reveal Wright had been saving for close-range combat. Agnes began to understand why Golden Domain's people had held formation despite facing an army many times larger than their entire population. They had spent months watching Wright turn impossible promises into food, homes, freedom, supernatural advancement, and victories against stronger enemies. To the defenders, standing behind him was not blind faith, but a conclusion built from repeated evidence that his preparations usually existed before danger became visible. That same history was invisible to the Spiders, who had judged Golden Domain from a brief visit and a lord whose aura could not be detected. The difference between those two perspectives was now being measured in shattered spider bodies across the open ground. Wright himself did not need to transform to dominate the shape of the battle, because the powers around him had been chosen, trained, and positioned deliberately. The Golden Tree let him use fruits personally, Yet distributing them had multiplied his influence through people who could act at different places and times. Harold had become the armored giant, Blake the warhammer giant, and Gordon carried another heroic transformation, still waiting for its battlefield debut. None of the Spider Scouts knew that roster when the Lord's War began, which made every human knight a sealed box until Wright chose to open it. Blake had been the first box opened during this elite assault, and the result had already forced bronze attackers to retreat. Gordon watched their movement with the expression of a man who had spent too long standing beside someone else having all the fun. The former mercenary had trained beside Blake through construction shifts and understood exactly how frustrating it was to possess extraordinary power without a proper battlefield. Moving stone, flattening earth, and practicing transformations had built familiarity, but none of it provided the rush Blake was experiencing now. Gordon could see that excitement in every giant movement, and competitive irritation began replacing the patience he had shown at the start of the fight. The retreating bronze Spider-Woman only made the temptation stronger because they were exactly the class of opponents his fruit had been meant to confront. He rolled tension from his shoulders and cracked his neck, while keeping his eyes on the enemies, pulling away from Blake. The gesture was almost casual despite the battlefield around him, as though Gordon were preparing for a training session instead of a Lord's War. Blake's success had removed uncertainty about whether the giant fruits could dominate real supernatural opponents at this rank. What remained for Gordon was the much simpler question of when Wright would allow him to join. Wright noticed the grin forming on his knight's face and understood the request without needing a shouted conversation over explosions and battle noise. Gordon had waded through the firearms, the catapult strikes, the breakthrough fighting, and Blake's transformation without abandoning his assigned position. That restraint mattered because Wright's entire defense depended on revealing strength in controlled stages rather than allowing excitement to destroy coordination. Now the bronze Spider-Woman were withdrawing from the Warhammer giant, creating the exact moment when a second transformation could deepen their confusion. Agnes was still trying to explain one human giant when Gordon prepared to make that explanation obsolete. The Spider-Mother's forces had barely adjusted to the idea that Blake carried giant blood before another ordinary-looking human knight became the center of Wright's attention. Gordon looked toward Wright rather than transforming on his own, showing that even with supernatural power available, command still remained with the Lord. That small act of discipline separated Golden Domain's defenders from the spider charge that had repeatedly dissolved into fear and anger. Wright had built his side around rolls, timing and trust, while the Spider-Mother increasingly relied on pressure strong enough to force frightened children forward. One army was revealing prepared tools, and the other was discovering those tools only after colliding with them. Gordon's grin widened as he watched Blake's massive hammer keep the nearest spiders from reclaiming the ground they had lost. He had no need to challenge Blake's strength directly, because his own fruit promised a completely different kind of giant. Wright remembered the class well enough to know that comparing the two transformations only by height would miss their real purpose. Blake's form was built around overwhelming mass and a colossal weapon, while Gordon's transformation traded some size for speed and a far more specialized body. That difference meant the second giant would not simply duplicate the first one standing on the same battlefield. It would reveal that Golden Domain's hidden powers came in distinct forms rather than one copied bloodline trick. Agnes could not know any of this as she stared from the forest, still struggling with the question of when humans had supposedly learned to become giants. Her confusion was reasonable, because nothing in ordinary human inheritance explained what Wright had done through golden tree fruits. To someone born in this world, bloodline was the most natural explanation for power that physically transformed a person's species and scale. Wright's old-world perspective made the truth almost comical, because he had effectively handed out abilities through magical fruit-like rewards from a game system. The humor stayed inside his head, while the consequences stood outside as a 7-meter giant covered in the evidence of destroyed spiders. Wright had no reason to explain the mechanism to Agnes, the Spider-Mother, or anyone else currently trying to take his territory. Mystery remained part of Golden Domain's defense, because enemies planned poorly when they could not tell which impossible rumor was real. Blake's transformation had just turned one such hidden truth into undeniable reality, and Gordon was ready to add another. The retreating bronze Spider-Woman continued creating distance from the Warhammer, their earlier formation broken by a threat too large to handle conventionally. Their withdrawal placed them directly inside the scene Gordon was watching, giving him a clear reason to seek permission instead of remaining beside Harold. He shifted his weight forward with the eagerness of a fighter who had finally reached the part of the plan written for him. Wright measured the field for one more moment, not because Gordon needed encouragement, but because every transformation consumed stamina and changed positioning. The Lord had survived this long by treating powerful abilities as resources rather than emotions, even when the people using them were desperate to begin. Blake had already created the opening, the enemy elites had stopped advancing, and the second reveal could now land while their confidence was weakest. Wright finally gave Gordon the small nod he had been waiting for. No elaborate ceremony was needed here because the fruit, oath, training, and secrecy had all been completed long before the battle began. The nod simply released a weapon Golden Domain had prepared in silence while Spider Territory assumed its neighbor remained weak. Gordon reacted immediately, his ordinary human outline disappearing as white steam burst outward around him. The vapor expanded fast enough to hide his arm or face and limbs while supernatural mass began forming inside the cloud. Nearby eyes shifted from Blake toward the new eruption because everyone on the battlefield had just learned what that kind of steam could mean. For the spiders, the sight threatened the impossible possibility that the first giant had not been unique. For Golden Domain's defenders, it confirmed that another part of Wright's hidden plan was finally entering the open. Gordon's body expanded upward through the steam, but the growing silhouette stopped below Blake's towering 7-meter height. The difference did not make the new form look harmless, because its proportions suggested something designed for movement rather than carrying an enormous hammer. The transformation settled at roughly 6 meters tall, still monstrous beside ordinary humans and spiders despite being smaller than the Warhammer giant. Gordon's giant body appeared leaner and more compact than Blake's, turning reduced mass into the visual promise of far greater speed. Where Blake dominated through reach and crushing weight, Gordon's new silhouette looked built to close distance before an opponent could react. Steam continued rolling from the transformed body as its defining feature emerged through the fading white cloud. The face was less a human face enlarged to giant scale than a structure dominated almost completely by its mouth. That enormous jaw gave the transformation its identity immediately, making the name Jaw Giant feel descriptive rather than ceremonial. Agnes had been searching for an explanation to one giant bloodline, and now a second human transformation stood beside the first with a completely different form. The reveal destroyed any easy theory that Blake alone possessed some rare inherited condition hidden from the Spider Scouts. Gordon had looked like another bronze human knight moments earlier, exactly the kind of fighter the Spider Mother believed her daughters could overwhelm with numbers. Now that same knight occupied 6 meters of battlefield beneath a cloud of steam, with a body emphasizing speed and a face built around a monstrous jaw. Wright remained in command behind both revelations, still physically smaller than the powers he had placed into the hands of loyal followers. That contrast captured the true danger Spider Territory had failed to detect when it judged the young lord by his visible aura alone. Golden Domain's strength did not stop at Wright's personal rank, because every system he built could turn another person into part of his advantage. Blake's Warhammer giant had already proven what one hidden fruit could do once the battle reached open ground. Gordon's 6-meter jaw giant now stood revealed as the next answer waiting inside Wright's layered defense. Steam swallowed the battlefield as Gordon completed his 6-meter jaw giant transformation beside Blake's towering Warhammer form.